The universe, in its vast and indifferent complexity, operates according to rules. Not suggestions, rules. The speed of light remains constant. Entropy increases. Cause precedes effect. These are not negotiable. The Federation had spent 4 centuries cataloging those rules, codifying them, building a civilization upon the bedrock certainty that the cosmos, however strange, however dangerous, however alien, was fundamentally comprehensible. Starfleet officers slept soundly in their bunks because they trusted those rules. They had to. Without them, every warp jump was a gamble, every transporter cycle a prayer, every away mission a coin flip into the void. Commander Elara Voss had trusted those rules her entire career. She stopped trusting them the moment the USS Meridian dropped out of emergency warp and her science station erupted in contradictions. "Position confirmed," said Ensign Tyrell from the con, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man reading sensor data he did not believe. "Sol system. We are in the Sol system." He paused. But what, Ensign?" Voss said, already moving from her command chair toward the tactical display. "Stellar cartography matches. Planetary alignment matches. Gravitational constants match." Another pause, longer this time. "But the electromagnetic profile of the third planet is..." He stopped again, as if saying it aloud would make it irreversible. "It's wrong, Commander. It's completely wrong." Voss looked at the view screen. Earth hung there, unmistakable in its blue-white beauty, the curve of a continent she recognized bleeding into cloud cover over an ocean she had studied in school. It was Earth. Every sensor on the ship agreed it was Earth. The gravitational signature, the atmospheric composition, the precise wobble of its axial tilt. All of it screamed home with a certainty that should have been comforting. Instead, she felt the floor tilt beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the ship's stabilizers. Because Earth in the 24th century did not have that electromagnetic signature. Earth in the 24th century had global sensor grids, a planetary shield network in preliminary deployment, subspace relay buoys in geosynchronous orbit, and the quantum-encrypted communications backbone of a world that had been talking to other worlds for over 300 years. The electromagnetic profile she was reading now was chaotic, primitive, beautiful in its own anarchic way. Thousands of competing frequencies, radio waves cascading over each other in the messy, inefficient, gloriously disorganized fashion of a civilization that had not yet learned to coordinate itself. "Confirmed reading on artificial satellites," said Lieutenant Okafor from Ops, her tone careful and precise in the way that Voss had come to recognize as her officer's method of controlling fear. "Low-orbit debris field consistent with early space-age development. I'm reading chemical propellant residue in the upper thermosphere. Carbon-based atmospheric pollutants at," she checked her readout twice. "Levels consistent with pre-reconstruction industrial output." Voss sat back down in the command chair very slowly. "What year," she said, not as a question so much as a sentence she needed to finish, "are we looking at?" Okafor ran the calculation. Voss watched her do it twice. Then she watched her do it a third time, as if the number might change. It didn't. Best estimate based on electromagnetic dating, satellite orbital decay patterns, and atmospheric composition cross-referenced with historical Federation records, Okafor looked up. "Approximately 2025, Commander. Give or take 18 months. The bridge went quiet in the way that bridges only go quiet when every person on them understands simultaneously that something has gone profoundly, irreversibly wrong. Voss thought about the subspace rupture. She thought about the experimental slipstream variance they'd hit at the edge of the Badlands, the way the warp field had inverted for 0.3 seconds before the emergency cutoff engaged, the blinding white cascade that had thrown half her crew out of their seats and knocked primary systems offline for 11 minutes. She thought about the temporal mechanics courses she'd taken at the academy, the ones she had passed with adequate marks and then filed in the back of her mind under unlikely to apply in practice. She thought about the Temporal Prime Directive. And then she thought about the fact that somewhere below her, on that impossibly familiar blue world, 7 billion human beings were going about their Tuesday, or their Wednesday, or whatever it was. Completely unaware that a starship from their own future was in low orbit watching them the way a child watches an anthill. "All stop," she said. "Full cloak. Shields to minimum passive profile. I want us invisible in the next 90 seconds. She stood up again. "And someone get me Lieutenant Commander Patel from Temporal Sciences. Right now. Whatever she was doing, she's done doing it." The Meridian slipped into silence above the cloud line, her hull absorbing light, her emission suppressed to background noise, her crew holding their collective breath in the way that people hold their breath when they are standing very close to something fragile and very aware of the size of their own hands. Below them, Earth turned. It did not know it was being watched. It did not know that the people watching it were, in a very real and technical sense, its own descendants. Products of every war it had not yet fought, every disease it had not yet cured, every mistake it had not yet made and would eventually learn from. It did not know that the vessel hanging invisible above its atmosphere carried technology that could end hunger, cure cancer, rewrite the geopolitical map of every nation on its surface in the span of an afternoon. It did not know any of that. But it was about to find out. Because the Meridian's cloak engaged 30 seconds too late, and a United States Space Force tracking station in Colorado had already logged 12 seconds of clean, unambiguous radar return from an object the size of a city block moving in a low-inclination orbit at speeds no known spacecraft could achieve. The data was flagged. Automatically. Instantly. Routed to 17 different agencies in 4 different countries before Commander Voss had finished giving her orders. The clock, without anyone on the Meridian's bridge asking it to, had already started. If you want to see more characters and civilizations enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop a name in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The Colorado Springs Space Force Tracking Station was officially designated Schriever Space Force Base, and it was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most sophisticated early warning facilities that the early 21st century had managed to produce. Its radar arrays could track objects the size of a softball in low Earth orbit. Its sensor fusion systems could correlate data from 17 different satellite networks simultaneously. Its analysts were among the best-trained military personnel on the planet, selected from thousands of candidates, drilled endlessly on the identification and classification of orbital threats ranging from Chinese anti-satellite missiles to Russian maneuvering vehicles to the occasional rogue piece of debris from a decades-old Soviet launch that had decided, after 30 years of patient orbiting, to finally become someone's problem. None of that training had prepared Master Sergeant Dwayne Holloway for what he was looking at 3:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at it the way a man looks at something when his brain is working very hard to find an explanation that does not require him to say out loud what he is actually thinking. He checked the radar return against the satellite catalog. He ran the velocity calculation twice. He looked at the thermal imaging overlay, which showed nothing. A perfect, absolute nothing where the radar said something the size of a mid-sized office building should be generating heat signatures consistent with whatever was keeping it aloft. Then he picked up the phone and called his supervisor. His supervisor called her supervisor. That supervisor, a colonel with 30 years of experience and the particular brand of calm that comes from having seen genuinely alarming things before, looked at the data for approximately 45 seconds and then initiated a protocol that had never, in the history of Schriever Space Force Base, been used outside of a drill. Within 6 minutes, the data had been transmitted to Peterson Space Force Base, to NORAD, to the Pentagon, and through a secure channel that most of the people in the building didn't officially know existed, to a small office in McLean, Virginia where a senior intelligence analyst was eating a late dinner at her desk and trying very hard not to think about the report she still hadn't finished. She put down her fork and started making calls. The object. Because that was what they were calling it, the object, in the careful neutral language that professionals use when they are trying not to prejudge a situation, had been tracked for 12 seconds before disappearing from radar completely. 12 seconds was not much. But 12 seconds of clean, unambiguous return from an object moving at 17 kilometers per second in a low-inclination orbit with no thermal signature, no visual confirmation, no registered launch, and no entry trajectory consistent with any known nation's space program was, it turned out, more than enough to wake up a very large number of very important people in the middle of the night. By 5 a.m. Eastern Time, the situation had a name. They called it Watchful. By 6 a.m., Watchful had its own task force. By 7 a.m., that task force had requisitioned time on 3 separate orbital imaging platforms, 2 of which were classified and 1 of which technically belonged to a private company whose cooperation had been secured through channels that would not appear in any official record. None of them found anything. The sky above the orbital track was empty. Clean. Perfectly, impossibly clean. Which, as the analyst in McLean noted in a memo that would later be described as either prescient or terrifying depending on who was reading it, was itself a data point. Things that large did not simply vanish. Unless they were designed to. Aboard the Meridian, Commander Voss was having the worst senior staff meeting of her career, which was saying something, because she had once presided over a senior staff meeting during which the ship was actively being boarded by Nausicaan pirates and the chief engineer had a disruptor wound that he was refusing to acknowledge. Lieutenant Commander Priya Patel, the Meridian's temporal sciences officer, had the particular expression of someone who had spent the last 2 hours running calculations and had arrived at conclusions she would have preferred not to arrive at. She was a small woman with dark eyes and the kind of precise, economical body language that came from years of working in a field where imprecision had consequences measured in centuries. She stood at the head of the briefing table in the ship's main conference room, the view screen behind her showing a slowly rotating holographic model of the temporal rupture that had deposited them here, its edges marked in the red that the Federation's temporal science community used to denote irreversible events. There was a lot of red. The rupture was caused by the interaction between our experimental slipstream variance drive and an uncharted subspace fold at coordinates that, in this time period, don't exist yet, Patel said, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone reading a diagnosis. The fold won't form for another 240 years. When our warp field intersected with its nascent quantum signature, it created a resonance cascade that inverted our temporal position by approximately 340 years. She paused. Give or take. Give or take, repeated Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief medical officer, from the far end of the table. He was a large, rumpled man with the expression of someone who had gone to medical school specifically to avoid situations like this one. That's a very casual qualifier for 340 years, Commander. Temporal science involves certain inherent imprecision, Doctor. Comforting. Voss cut across the exchange before it could develop. Can we get back? Patel pulled up a second display. The subspace fold that pulled us here is still present, but it's in a dormant state. Think of it like a door that opened, let us through, and then closed. To reopen it, we need to generate a precise warp field inversion that mirrors the original cascade signature. The problem. She highlighted a section of the display in amber. Is that generating that kind of field inversion requires a full power warp core burn at close range to the fold's coordinates. Which means we cannot do it quietly. Any civilization within this solar system with even basic electromagnetic detection capability will register an energy output roughly equivalent to a small star going briefly unstable. So we'd announce ourselves to the entire planet, said Lieutenant Commander Torres, the ship's security chief, from across the table. He was a broad-shouldered man with a veteran's habit of cataloging exits, and Voss had noticed him glancing at the conference room door 3 times since the meeting started. We would be somewhat difficult to miss, yes, Patel confirmed. How long do we have before the fold destabilizes completely and closes permanently? Voss asked. Patel's expression did something complicated. 17 days. After that, the quantum signature dissipates and the fold collapses. We would need to find an alternative method of temporal displacement, which in this time period means we'd be stranded, Voss said. Indefinitely, yes. The room was quiet for a moment. Through the conference room's narrow viewport, the curve of Earth was visible. Impossibly blue, heartbreakingly familiar, turning with the patient indifference of a world that had no idea it was hosting a crisis. Chief Engineer Vasquez broke the silence. What about the cloak? We engaged it late. 12 seconds of exposure before the array came online. She pulled up her own display, routing through the ship's tactical log. I've already run a spectral analysis of what any ground-based radar would have seen in that window. Partial return, velocity inconsistent with any known 2025-era spacecraft, no thermal profile. She looked at Voss. Commander, they saw us. Not clearly. Not enough to know what we are. But they saw something. How long before they start looking seriously? Torres asked. They're already looking, Vasquez said. I've been monitoring their communications since we cloaked. Military frequencies, government encryption bands, activity has spiked significantly in the last 2 hours. They flagged us immediately. Voss stood up from the table and walked to the viewport. She looked at Earth for a long moment. She thought about everything she knew about this period in human history, the wars, the political fractures, the desperate, grinding work of a civilization trying to solve problems that her own era had long since consigned to the history books. She thought about what it meant for a pre-warp civilization to encounter evidence of extraterrestrial technology. She thought about first contact protocols and what they specifically said about pre-contact civilizations and the damage that premature exposure could do to a culture still in the process of finding its own footing. She thought about the fact that the people below her were, in every meaningful sense, her ancestors. The Temporal Prime Directive is in effect, she said, without turning around. Full operational silence. No active scans that could be detected. No communications on any frequency that could be intercepted. No personnel transfers to the surface under any circumstances. She turned back to the table. Chief Engineer Vasquez broke the silence. What about the cloak? We engaged it late. 12 seconds of exposure before the array came online. She pulled up her own display, routing through the ship's tactical log. I've already run a spectral analysis of what any ground-based radar would have seen in that window. Partial return, velocity inconsistent with any known 2025-era spacecraft, no thermal profile. She looked at Voss. Commander, they saw us. Not clearly. Not enough to know what we are. But they saw something. How long before they start looking seriously? Torres asked. They're already looking, Vasquez said. I've been monitoring their communications since we cloaked. Military frequencies, government encryption bands, activity has spiked significantly in the last 2 hours. They flagged us immediately. Voss stood up from the table and walked to the viewport. She looked at Earth for a long moment. She thought about everything she knew about this period in human history, the wars, the political fractures, the desperate, grinding work of a civilization trying to solve problems that her own era had long since consigned to the history books. She thought about what it meant for a pre-warp civilization to encounter evidence of extraterrestrial technology. She thought about first contact protocols and what they specifically said about pre-contact civilizations and the damage that premature exposure could do to a culture still in the process of finding its own footing. She thought about the fact that the people below her were, in every meaningful sense, her ancestors. The Temporal Prime Directive is in effect, she said, without turning around. Full operational silence. No active scans that could be detected. No communications on any frequency that could be intercepted. No personnel transfers to the surface under any circumstances. She turned back to the table. We assess, we plan, and we find a way to reopen that fold without burning half the sky to do it. Questions. There were questions. There were many questions. She answered the ones she could and made notes of the ones she couldn't, which were the more important ones, and the meeting dissolved into the controlled urgency of a crew that understood the stakes and had decided, collectively, to be professional about them. What she did not tell her crew. What she filed away in the private ledger of things a commander knows and carries alone, was the other thing Patel had said to her, quietly, before the rest of the senior staff had arrived for the briefing. The thing about the timeline readings. About how the quantum signature of the fold was not entirely consistent with an accidental rupture. About how the probability modeling suggested, at a confidence interval that Patel had described as uncomfortably high, that something had pulled them here. Not pushed. Pulled. As if the 21st century had reached forward through 340 years of time and decided, for reasons Voss could not yet fathom, that it needed them. Below the ship, in a secure facility in Colorado, Master Sergeant Dwayne Holloway was writing his incident report. He was choosing his words carefully. He had spent 20 years choosing words carefully. But there was one word that kept appearing at the edge of his thoughts, the word that the data kept pointing toward no matter how many alternative explanations he tried to construct around it, and he was going to have to write it eventually. He picked up his pen. He started a new paragraph. He wrote, "The object demonstrated capabilities inconsistent with any known human aerospace program." Based on available sensor data, the following conclusion, however unlikely, cannot be excluded. He stopped. He looked at the word waiting at the end of that sentence. He looked at it for a long time. Then he wrote it down. The Temporal Prime Directive was not, as many junior Starfleet officers discovered to their disappointment, a simple document. It was not a clean set of rules with clear boundaries and obvious applications, the kind of ethical framework that could be memorized, internalized, and then applied to situations with the comfortable certainty of someone following a recipe. It was, instead, a living document in the truest sense. A body of regulation, precedent, philosophical argument, and hard-won institutional wisdom that had been built up over 2 centuries of Starfleet officers doing exactly the wrong thing in temporal situations and then writing extensively about why they had done it and what had gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong as a result. It was, in other words, a document written in the ink of mistakes, and it was long, and it was complicated, and it contradicted itself in places that temporal theorists had been arguing about since the 22nd century. Commander Elara Voss knew it well. She had studied it at the academy, had revisited it during her tactical command certification, had sat through 3 separate Starfleet seminars on its practical application in crisis scenarios. She knew its philosophical foundations, its legal precedents, its edge cases, its internal tensions. She knew, in particular, the central principle around which everything else orbited like planets around a star. A Starfleet officer in a temporal displacement situation was not, under any circumstances, to take action that could alter the natural development of the timeline. Interference was not merely prohibited. It was classified, in the directive's own language, as among the most serious violations a Starfleet officer could commit, graver than weapons trafficking, graver than espionage, sitting in the same moral category as genocide, because the logic was that a sufficiently altered timeline was a form of murder committed against everyone who had ever lived in it or would ever live in it. She knew all of that. She believed all of that. She was also sitting in her ready room at 0200 ship's time, staring at a sensor summary that Lieutenant Commander Patel had delivered 40 minutes ago, and finding that belief slightly harder to hold on to than it had been the day before. The summary was thorough. Patel was always thorough. It covered the current geopolitical state of Earth in 2025 with the kind of clean, analytical precision that made the reality it was describing feel almost academic. Until you sat with it long enough for the weight of it to settle in. Climate destabilization accelerating beyond the models that had been optimistic even at the time. Resource conflicts metastasizing across 3 continents. Political systems under stresses that the history books Voss had studied described as the precursor period to the Third World War. Not as a certainty, but as a probability that had climbed high enough in this decade to constitute a genuine threat to the civilization that would eventually, if everything went correctly, evolve into the Federation. The same Federation whose uniform Voss was wearing. The same Federation whose principles she was currently using to justify staying hidden above a world that was quietly, incrementally, in the process of tearing itself apart. She had read the history. She knew how it turned out. Humanity pulled back from the edge. Not gracefully, not without cost. The historical record was unflinching about the cost, but it pulled back. First contact happened. Zephram Cochrane flew his warp ship and the Vulcans came and the world changed. The story had an ending, and it was a good ending, and every temporal theorist in the Federation agreed that the worst thing a displaced Starfleet officer could do was reach into that story and start adjusting it, because stories that had good endings were not guaranteed to keep them if you started pulling threads. Voss knew all of that too. She closed the censor summary and pulled up a different file. Historical record, 21st century, mid-2020s. Specific incident logs cross-referenced with the current sensor picture of Earth's surface. She was looking for the moment, the precise historical moment, that the planet's radar logs from this date and this location would eventually be filed under, catalogued, and either explained away or lost in the noise of a world that had too many crises to spend very long on any single anomaly. She was looking, in other words, for evidence that what had already happened. The 12 seconds of radar exposure before the cloak engaged, had been absorbed by the timeline without consequence. That the data point had been filed and forgotten. That the story was still on track. The historical record did not have a reassuring answer for her. Not because it contained evidence of damage. But because the mid-2020s historical record, as preserved in the Federation's extensive archival database, had a gap. A small one. Precisely located. Centered on a series of classified military intelligence reports from North American defense agencies in October 2025 that had never been fully declassified, even by the time of the Federation's founding. Reports that historians had noted in passing but never been able to access. Reports that were catalogued under a designation that had been redacted in every surviving record. Watchful. Voss sat with that for a long time. Lieutenant Commander Torres had divided his security staff into rotating 4-hour monitoring shifts, each team responsible for a different band of Earth's electromagnetic spectrum. Military communications on one channel. Government-civilian networks on another. Public broadcasts, news, social media aggregators, the chaotic democratic noise of a civilization that had not yet learned to curate its own information, on a third. He was sitting in the security hub on Deck 7, coffee going cold beside him, watching the public broadcast feed with the particular expression of a man who is watching something he expected to be alarming confirm itself as alarming in ways he had not quite anticipated. The story had broken at 6:23 a.m. Eastern Time, through a chain of events that Torres had been able to reconstruct with reasonable confidence from the communications intercepts his team had been monitoring. A junior analyst at one of the tracking facilities had mentioned the anomaly to a friend. The friend had mentioned it to someone else. That someone else had a social media account and a fondness for aerospace speculation, and by the time the relevant government agencies had begun the process of classifying the raw sensor data, a screenshot of a preliminary incident report, partial, blurry, stripped of its most sensitive identifiers but unmistakably real, had been posted to 3 different online platforms simultaneously. The internet, Torres reflected, watching the engagement metrics climb in real time on his monitoring display, was a remarkable thing. He had studied it at the Academy in the context of Federation communications history, understood it intellectually as the precursor to the subspace relay networks that connected the Federation's member worlds. But there was something different about seeing it operate in this raw, early form, unfiltered, unmoderated in any meaningful sense, simultaneously the greatest information-sharing tool and the greatest misinformation engine that the planet had yet produced, and both of those things at full power at the same moment, pointed at the same story. The screenshot went viral within 40 minutes. By the time it had been shared 2 million times, 3 aerospace engineers with legitimate credentials had posted detailed technical analyses explaining why the radar return was inconsistent with any known spacecraft. By the time it had been shared 5 million times, a sitting member of the United States Senate had posted a statement demanding immediate government transparency. By the time it reached 10 million shares, the story had been picked up by every major news network on the planet, and the word that Master Sergeant Holloway had written in his incident report, the word at the end of the carefully constructed sentence that he had spent 20 years of professional discipline preparing himself to never have to write, was trending in 47 languages simultaneously. Torres pulled up a translation matrix and watched the word replicate itself across the monitoring display in script after script, language after language, each one carrying the same freight of 7 billion people confronting simultaneously a question that their civilization had been asking itself since the first human being looked up at the night sky and wondered if anything out there was looking back. He tapped his comm badge. Torres to bridge. We have a situation developing on the surface. Commander Voss needs to see the public broadcast feed immediately. The response came back in Ensign Tyrell's voice, tight with the specific tension of someone who had already been watching. She's already on her way, Lieutenant Commander. And sir, a brief pause. You should know that we're also picking up a significant increase in military sensor activity. They're not just using ground-based radar anymore. They've repositioned at least 2 orbital imaging platforms in the last hour. They're scanning our position. Torres looked at the empty space on his tactical display where the Meridian's cloaked position sat invisible and, for the moment, undetected. How close? Not close enough to pierce the cloak. Not yet. Another pause. But they know where to look, sir. The radar return gave them a precise orbital track. They're methodical. Torres thought about that word. Methodical. He thought about what he knew of 21st century Earth's military capabilities. Limited by Federation-era standards, but not negligible, and more importantly, operated by people who were frightened and well-funded and had spent decades developing contingency plans for exactly this kind of scenario, even if those plans had been written as fiction rather than operational doctrine. He thought about the 17 days they had before the fold closed permanently. He thought about 7 billion people who had just collectively decided they were not alone in the universe, and who were now waiting, with all the patience and restraint that humanity in 2025 could be expected to muster, for something to happen next. Voss walked into the security hub 40 seconds later, looked at the monitoring displays, and stood very still for a moment. Torres watched her take it in. The news feeds, the social media cascade, the orbital sensor repositioning, the military communication spike that his team had color-coded in red because there was no other color that made sense for it. They know something is up there, she said. Not a question. They know something was up there, Torres corrected carefully. They don't know we're still here. The cloak is holding. But they have our orbital track from the initial exposure and they're being systematic about searching it. He pulled up the tactical overlay. At current scan frequency and coverage expansion rate, I estimate they'll have covered our position with at least 3 independent sensor platforms within. He checked the calculation. 31 hours. Voss looked at the tactical overlay for a long moment. Then she looked at the news feed, where a network anchor was interviewing a retired military official who was being carefully, professionally non-committal about what the leaked radar data meant, while behind him a Chiron scrolled in large letters that required no translation matrix whatsoever. She read it twice. Then she turned to Torres and said, very quietly, "Get me Patel and Vasquez in the briefing room in 10 minutes. And pull every historical record we have on Watchful." Torres frowned. Watchful? That's a classified 2025 military intelligence designation, Voss said. Yes. Pull everything we have on it. Including the parts that were never declassified. She was already moving toward the door. Especially those parts. Torres watched her go. Then he looked back at the monitoring display, at the words still trending in 47 languages, at the orbital sensor platforms repositioning themselves with quiet mechanical patience above the cloud line, at the news anchor still carefully not saying what everyone watching already believed. He thought about the 17 days. He thought about the fold. He thought about what it meant that the historical record had a gap, precisely located, precisely dated, centered on a classified designation that his commander had just asked him to pull. He pulled it. What came back was sparse. A catalog entry. A date range. A security classification that had never been lifted. And a single line of descriptive text, preserved in the Federation's historical archive from some long-ago declassification review that had decided this much, at least, could be released. It read, Watchful, Classified Joint Intelligence Program, Origin October 2025. Nature and scope remain restricted. Program terminated, redacted. Final disposition of collected materials, redacted. Assessment, contained. Torres stared at the word at the end for a long time. Contained. He was not sure whether that was reassuring or the most frightening thing he had read all day. The briefing room on Deck 4 had a viewport that faced directly toward Earth, and Commander Voss had made no move to close the shutter. The planet hung there throughout the entire meeting like a third participant. Vast and blue and patient, turning slowly on its axis with the serene indifference of something that had been doing exactly this for 4.5 billion years and intended to keep doing it regardless of what a group of people from its own future decided in a room above its atmosphere. Voss found, to her mild irritation, that she could not stop glancing at it. There was something about looking at Earth from orbit that did things to a person's sense of scale and proportion, and she needed her sense of scale and proportion intact for this conversation. Patel had brought her full temporal analysis suite, the kind of comprehensive briefing package that she clearly had been building since the moment they had confirmed their position and had been refining through the night watch with the focused intensity of someone who understood that incomplete information in a temporal displacement situation was not merely an inconvenience but a potential civilizational catastrophe. She spread it across the briefing table's holographic display in careful, color-coded layers, temporal variance readings in blue, historical record cross-references in gold, probability modeling in green, and the areas of uncertainty, the places where the data ran out or contradicted itself or simply refused to resolve into anything actionable, in a deep, uncomfortable amber that seemed to Voss to take up more of the display than she would have liked. Vasquez had brought coffee, which Voss appreciated more than she could reasonably articulate at this hour. Start with Watchful, Voss said. Patel nodded and pulled the historical record entry to the center of the display. It sat there in its sparse, maddening incompleteness, the date range, the classification, the single line of descriptive text, the redaction stacked like black bars over everything that might have been useful. The Federation Historical Archive has 17 references to the Watchful designation across 12 separate documents, Patel said. All of them classified at the point of origin. 11 of the 17 have been partially declassified over the centuries, but the declassification process appears to have been selective. The released portions confirm that Watchful was a joint intelligence program involving at minimum 3 national defense agencies and at least 1 civilian scientific organization. The unreleased portions, she gestured at the amber zones on the display, cover the program's specific findings, its operational scope, and its termination date. Terminated and contained, Torres said, from across the table, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who had been sitting with a word he didn't like for the better part of an hour. Those are 2 different things. A surveillance program gets terminated. You contain something that needs containing. That was my read as well, Patel said. The linguistic distinction in the archival entry is not consistent with standard administrative language for program closure. It's consistent with incident management. Meaning they found us, Vasquez said. Meaning they found something, Patel corrected carefully. We cannot confirm from the archival record alone that Watchful is specifically a response to the Meridian's presence. The program could have been initiated in response to the radar anomaly and then expanded to encompass other activities. Or it could have been initiated in response to something we haven't done yet. She paused, letting that land. That is the fundamental problem with trying to use historical records to navigate a situation you are currently inside. Causality becomes recursive. Voss looked at the display. She looked at the amber zones. She thought about recursive causality and what it meant for 17 days and a fold that needed to stay open long enough for them to get home. What's our probability modeling showing? Patel pulled the green layer forward. The holographic display reorganized itself into a branching tree of probability cascades, each branch representing a different decision point and its downstream consequences, color-shaded from deep green through yellow into red depending on the assessed risk to timeline integrity. It was, Voss thought, an extraordinarily complex tree. The branches subdivided into sub-branches into further sub-branches until the rightmost portions of the display were a dense thicket of yellow and red that was genuinely difficult to look at. The central finding, Patel said, is that the 12 seconds of radar exposure before we cloaked has already introduced what temporal science calls a Type 2 contamination event. A Type 2 event is defined as an anomalous datum that is detected and recorded by the contemporary civilization but not acted upon in a way that alters the primary historical trajectory. She highlighted a thick green branch that ran through the center of the tree. The good news is that the historical record, fragmentary as it is consistent with a Type 2 resolution. Watchful is classified and contained. The mainstream historical narrative of this period shows no evidence of a society-wide first contact event prior to the Cochrane mission. The world below us is not, based on available evidence, on a path toward discovering the full truth of what we are. And the bad news, Torres said, because there was always bad news, and in Voss's experience the bad news was always the more important half of the briefing. The bad news, Patel said, pulling the amber zones back to prominence, is that Type 2 contamination events have a documented tendency to escalate if the source of the anomaly remains present. The radar return was a single data point. 12 seconds of ambiguous sensor data that a sufficiently motivated civilization can investigate, classify, and ultimately explain away or quietly bury. But we have 17 days left in this time period. 17 days during which we are a starship in low Earth orbit above a planet whose militaries are now actively searching for us. Every hour we remain here is an additional opportunity for the contamination event to escalate from a Type 2 to a Type 3. Which is defined as an anomalous datum that is acted upon in a way that does alter the primary historical trajectory. She looked at Voss directly. A Type 3 contamination event at this point in Earth's history, this close to the pre-war period, carries a probability of cascading timeline damage that the modeling assesses as, she checked her display. Significant. Define significant, Vasquez said. The kind of significant that temporal scientists use when they mean catastrophic but want to preserve the option of being wrong, Patel said. The room was quiet for a moment. Earth turned in the viewport. So we need to reopen the fold, Voss said. Faster than 17 days if possible. And we need to do it without lighting up every sensor on the planet in the process. She turned to Vasquez. Tell me you have something. Vasquez set down her coffee and pulled up her own display, routing it into the holographic table so it overlaid Patel's probability tree with engineering schematics in clean white lines. She was the kind of engineer who thought in solutions rather than problems, which Voss had always found reassuring, and she had the particular look of someone who had been running calculations in parallel with everything else that had happened in the past several hours and had arrived at something that was not quite good news but was at least in the neighborhood of workable. The full-power warp core burn that Patel's model requires to reopen the fold, that's off the table, Vasquez said. That's 1,000 terawatts of directed energy output. Every electromagnetic sensor on this planet and 3 of their orbital platforms would register it simultaneously. It would be visible to the naked eye from the surface. We would, effectively, be announcing ourselves to 7 billion people with a signal that could not be classified, explained away, or quietly buried. She advanced her display to a secondary schematic. But the full power burn is only required if we're trying to reopen the fold from a cold start. If we can precondition the quantum signature of the fold, essentially warm it up, prime it for a lower energy reopening, we can reduce the required output by approximately 63%. 63% still leaves us with a significant energy signature, Torres said. 400 terawatts instead of 1,000, Vasquez agreed. Still detectable. Still problematic. But here's the thing, she pulled up a third schematic, this one showing the planet's electromagnetic environment in a visual that looked, to Voss, as something like a weather map rendered in pure light, dense, complex, layered with competing signals. Earth in 2025 has an electromagnetic environment that is, from a sensor interference standpoint, extraordinarily noisy. Thousands of satellite platforms, ground-based radar arrays, industrial electromagnetic output, natural solar activity, it's a genuinely complex background. If we time our energy output to coincide with a natural solar event that creates sufficient background noise, and if we position ourselves on the far side of the planet relative to their primary sensor arrays, the signature of a 400 terawatt directed energy pulse becomes less obvious. Less obvious, Voss repeated. Considerably less obvious, Vasquez confirmed. Not invisible. But consistent, potentially, with a natural phenomenon. A particularly energetic coronal mass ejection from the Sun, or a significant geomagnetic storm event. She looked at her display. As it happens, the historical record for this specific date period in October 2025 includes a documented geomagnetic storm event. Class G3. Strong enough to disrupt radio communications across the northern hemisphere and generate significant background electromagnetic noise. She looked up. It's in 4 days. Voss looked at her for a moment. You're saying we have a 4-day window to precondition the fold, and then we use the geomagnetic storm as cover for the reopening pulse. I'm saying it's theoretically possible, Vasquez said carefully. The preconditioning process involves low-level subspace field emissions that are well within our cloak's ability to mask. The reopening pulse would be the risk. But with the G3 storm as background noise and careful positioning, she spread her hands in the gesture of an engineer who has run the numbers and is presenting the results with appropriate honesty about their limitations. The historical record shows watchful was contained. Whatever they detected, it wasn't enough to break the timeline. Maybe this is why. The recursion of it settled over the table like a change in air pressure. Maybe the plan that they were currently formulating in this briefing room was the plan that had always been formulated in this briefing room, and the reason the historical record showed containment was precisely because they found a way to do this quietly and got home without breaking anything. Maybe the amber zones in Patel's probability model were amber rather than red because someone in their position had looked at the same numbers and made the same decision and it had worked. Or maybe the amber zones were amber because the situation was still unresolved and the decision hadn't been made yet and the timeline was holding its breath. Begin preconditioning, Voss said. Low-level emissions only, fully masked by the cloak. I want daily progress reports from both of you. She looked around the table. In the meantime, we maintain full operational silence. No active scans. No surface contact. No deviation from the Temporal Prime Directive. She stood, signaling the end of the meeting. We are going to get home in 4 days, and the only footprint we're going to leave on this timeline is the one that's already there. She said it with the authority of a commanding officer who had made a decision and was committed to it. She said it the way you say things when you need the people around you to believe them, and when you need, perhaps, to believe them yourself. What she did not say, what she kept in the private ledger again, alongside the question of what had pulled them here, was what she had noticed in the corner of Patel's probability model, in a sub-branch so far from the main trunk that it was easy to miss. Shaded in a color that was neither amber nor red but something between them that the modeling software had apparently generated specifically for this scenario because no existing category was sufficient. A branch that accounted for the possibility that they were not the only variable in this situation. That Earth in 2025, methodical and frightened and newly certain that something was in its sky, was not simply going to wait patiently for 4 days while a starship from its future quietly went about its business above the cloud line. That branch was very short. It terminated quickly. And what it terminated in was not labeled with a probability assessment at all. It was labeled with a question mark. Dr. Elara Voss had not slept in 31 hours, which was not, by the standards of her particular career, especially unusual. She was a senior research scientist at the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Institute in Mountain View, California, and insomnia was something of an occupational hazard in a field that required you to maintain genuine intellectual openness to the possibility that the universe contained other minds while simultaneously subjecting every candidate's signal to a level of scrutiny that had, over the course of 60 years of institutional history, explained away every single one of them. You developed, in that environment, a particular relationship with sleeplessness. It became a companion rather than an affliction. Something you carried with you through the long nights of data analysis and the longer days of explaining to journalists and funding committees why the absence of confirmed contact was not the same thing as the absence of life. She had been awake since the screenshot went viral. She had watched it happen in real time, sitting at her workstation in the Institute's main analysis lab with 3 monitors running and a 4th she had commandeered from a colleague's desk for the duration. She had watched the social media cascade with the practiced analytical detachment of someone who had been through this particular cycle before. The breathless initial spread, the credentialed voices weighing in with measured caution, the inevitable bifurcation into the people who wanted it to be real and the people who needed it not to be, the slow convergence on a consensus that was almost never the truth and almost always the most socially convenient available option. She had seen it with the 2017 Pentagon UAP footage. She had seen it with the interstellar object. She had seen it with the biosignature candidates from the exoplanet surveys. She knew how the cycle worked and she knew how it ended, and she had not expected this time to be different. Except that this time she had run the numbers herself. The leaked radar return data was partial and degraded, stripped of its most sensitive technical parameters before it had been posted online, but it was not so degraded that a person with her specific expertise could not extract meaningful information from what remained. She had spent 6 hours doing exactly that, cross-referencing the radar signature against every aerospace database she had legitimate access to and several she had access to through channels that were technically within the bounds of her institute's research agreements if you read those agreements in a particular way and didn't look too closely at the margin cases. She had checked her results 4 times. She had called 2 colleagues, one in the United Kingdom and one in Australia, and walked them through her methodology without telling them what she had found, asking them instead to run the analysis independently and report back. They had reported back within 2 hours of each other. All 3 analyses agreed. The object that had generated the radar return was real. It was large, larger than any human-made spacecraft currently in orbit or in development, larger than the International Space Station by a factor that was difficult to express without using numbers that sounded like science fiction. It had been moving at a velocity that was inconsistent with orbital mechanics as applied to any known propulsion system. It had generated no thermal signature, which meant either that its propulsion system produced no waste heat, which was physically impossible for any known engine type, or that it was somehow masking its thermal output, which implied a level of technological sophistication that the word advanced did not adequately capture. And it had disappeared from radar with an abruptness that was not consistent with the object leaving the detection range, but with the object ceasing to be detectable. As if it had, in the span of a single radar return cycle, become invisible. Elara Voss had spent 30 years preparing herself intellectually and emotionally for the moment when the evidence became unambiguous. She had given lectures about it. She had written papers about the psychological and sociological dimensions of confirmed first contact. She had counseled colleagues through the grief of signals that turned out to be pulsars and the particular, complicated disappointment of a candidate biosignature that resolved into atmospheric chemistry. She had thought, in short, that she was ready. She was not ready. She was sitting at her workstation at 2 a.m. with cold coffee and 3 independent analyses that all said the same thing, and she was not ready at all, and the feeling that had replaced readiness was something she did not have a precise word for, a compound of awe and terror and a kind of vertiginous joy that made it difficult to sit still and equally difficult to stand up. She picked up her phone. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought about who to call. She put the phone down. She picked up a pen instead. She pulled a legal pad from her desk drawer and she started writing, in the careful, methodical language of a scientist constructing a hypothesis, everything she knew and everything she could reasonably infer and everything that would need to be true for her analysis to be correct. She wrote for an hour without stopping. When she put the pen down, she had 4 pages of dense, precise notes and a hypothesis that she could not share with anyone, not yet, not without something more than 3 independent analyses of a degraded radar return that the government had already begun the process of officially explaining as a sensor malfunction caused by unusual atmospheric conditions over the Colorado Rockies. She needed signal. Direct signal. Something that had not been filtered through a screenshot and a social media cascade and the government's institutional interest in maintaining public order. She looked at her monitoring equipment. She looked at the radio telescope feed that her institute maintained in a continuous, automated scan of the electromagnetic spectrum, searching with patient algorithmic persistence for the narrow-band signals that her institute's founding philosophy held would be the first indicator of an extraterrestrial intelligence capable of interstellar communication. She looked at it for a long time. Then she did something that she had never done in 30 years of professional practice. She overrode the automated scan parameters. She took manual control of the Institute's primary receiver array. And she pointed it, with precise and deliberate intention, at the orbital track that the leaked radar data had given her. She put on her headphones. She adjusted the gain. She set the frequency sweep to cover the full range of bands that a technologically sophisticated source might use for local area communication, not the interstellar frequencies her institute normally monitored, but the short-range, high-bandwidth frequencies that a vessel in low Earth orbit might use for internal communications or active scanning. She listened. Aboard the Meridian, the alert came from Lieutenant Okafor at 0317 ship's time, and it came in the tone that Voss had come to recognize as her operations officer's version of alarm, not the sharp urgency of an immediate threat, but the careful, measured tension of someone who has detected something unexpected and is taking the time to verify it before reporting because the situation is too important for an error. Commander. Okafor's voice over the intercom carried that tone precisely. I'm picking up a ground-based electromagnetic scan. Narrowband, high gain, pointed directly at our position. Voss was on the bridge in 40 seconds. She looked at Okafor's display and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was a complicated kind of respect. That's a radio telescope array, she said. Yes, Commander. Cross-referenced against historical databases, Okafor pulled up the identification. SETI Institute, Mountain View, California. The array has been manually redirected from its standard survey parameters within the last hour. Someone overrode the automated scan and pointed it at us deliberately. They know where to look, Torres said, from tactical, his voice carrying the weight of a man updating a threat assessment in real time. They don't know what they're looking for, Voss said carefully. They know the orbital track from the radar return. They're searching it. She looked at the frequency display showing the range of the incoming scan. And they're not using military frequencies. This isn't a defense installation. This is a scientific facility. She studied the scan parameters for a moment. Someone who understands what they saw is trying to make contact through the only channel they have available. The bridge was quiet for a moment. The scan swept across their position with the patient, methodical rhythm of a signal designed to cover as much of the frequency spectrum as possible, not aggressive, not threatening, but purposeful. Deliberate. The electromagnetic equivalent of a knock on a door. Voss thought about the Temporal Prime Directive. She thought about Type 2 contamination events and Type 3 contamination events and the amber zones in Patel's probability model. She thought about 4 days and a geomagnetic storm and a preconditioning process that was progressing on schedule in the lower decks and needed to keep progressing without complication. She thought about a scientist sitting alone in a building somewhere in California at 3 in the morning, having run the numbers herself, having called colleagues, having checked and rechecked and arrived at the only conclusion the data supported, now sitting with headphones on in the dark and listening to the frequency range where a starship in low orbit might be talking to itself. She thought about what it meant to be that person. What kind of courage that required. What kind of loneliness. Can we characterize the signal source more precisely, she asked. Individual operator, or automated system? Okafor ran the analysis. The scan pattern is consistent with manual operation. The frequency sweep is slightly irregular, the kind of variability you see with human-controlled equipment rather than automated algorithmic scanning. There's someone physically at the controls. One person. One scientist, awake at 3 a.m, pointing a radio telescope at an empty piece of sky because the numbers told her something was there. Maintain operational silence, Voss said. And then, almost immediately, felt the words sit wrong in her mouth in a way that was difficult to articulate and impossible to ignore. She stood at the center of the bridge for a long moment, looking at the frequency display, watching the scan sweep back and forth across their position with its patient, hopeful rhythm. She thought about the Prime Directive and its foundational logic, the argument that premature contact damaged civilizations, disrupted their natural development, imposed external frameworks on cultures that needed to find their own way. She believed that argument. She had always believed it. But the Temporal Prime Directive was specifically about not altering the timeline. And the question that was forming itself in the back of her mind, with increasing clarity and increasing discomfort, was whether responding to this signal would alter the timeline, or whether it was already written into the timeline that she would respond to it. Whether the scientist in California was in the historical record precisely because this moment happened. Whether Watchful was contained precisely because of a choice that Voss had not yet made but was already, in some sense, committed to. She looked at the scan. She looked at Earth turning in the view screen. She looked at Torres and Okafor and Ensign Tyrell, all of them watching her with the careful attention of a crew that understood their commander was at a decision point and was waiting to see which way she went. She thought about the question mark at the end of the sub-branch in Patel's probability model. Okafor, she said, very quietly. What's the narrowest band, lowest power transmission we can generate? Something that would be received by a high-gain antenna pointed directly at us but would be effectively undetectable to any other sensor platform at any other angle? Okafor looked at her. Then she looked at her display. Then she ran the calculation with the focused precision of someone who was not going to ask the question she was clearly thinking, because the commander had already decided and what was needed now was an answer, not a debate. Tight beam narrowband burst at minimum power, she said. Duration under 2 seconds. Received signal strength would be sufficient for detection by the array currently scanning us. Probability of detection by any other platform at current scan frequencies. She checked the number. Less than 1%. Voss nodded. She looked at the frequency display for another moment. She thought about what to say, what single transmission, under 2 seconds, could possibly be adequate for this moment and for what came after it and for the weight of everything it represented. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, send the following. Text only, no voice, no data package. Encoded in a format consistent with early 21st century digital communication protocols so it's immediately readable without specialized equipment. She paused. Message reads, we are here. We mean no harm. Do not share this signal. More to follow. Okafor looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then she turned back to her console and began composing the transmission with the quiet efficiency of a Starfleet officer who understood that history, whatever else it was, had to start somewhere. The transmission took 1.3 seconds. It traveled at the speed of light, which in the distance between a cloaked starship and a radio telescope array in Mountain View, California meant it arrived almost instantaneously. In a lab in California, a pair of headphones registered a signal. NDR. Amara Osei, who had spent 30 years preparing for this moment and was not ready for it at all, pulled the headphones away from her ears and looked at the readout on her monitor and sat very, very still for a long time. Then she picked up her pen. She turned to a fresh page of her legal pad. The note that Dr. Elara Voss wrote at the top of the fresh page was not, as she would later reflect, particularly eloquent. It was 3 words, written in capital letters, underlined twice, with the kind of pressure that leaves an impression on the page beneath. It read, "Verify before acting." It was the first principle of scientific method applied to the most unscientific moment of her life, and writing it steadied her hands and slowed her breathing and gave her something to hold on to while the rest of her mind processed what her monitor was still displaying in clean, unambiguous digital text. "We are here. We mean no harm. Do not share this signal. More to follow." She read it 6 times. She read it the way you read something when your brain keeps sliding off the surface of the words because the implications beneath them are too large to absorb all at once. She ran a signal analysis on the transmission, frequency, modulation, encoding format, signal strength, angle of incidence. And the results were exactly what she had expected them to be and exactly what she had been hoping they would not be, because hope, in her experience, was the enemy of rigorous analysis, and she had been trying for 30 years to keep hope and analysis in separate rooms of her mind, and right now they had broken down the door between them and were standing in the same space staring at each other. The signal was real. It was not interference. It was not a natural phenomenon dressed up in digital encoding. It was not a reflection artifact or a system malfunction or a misidentified terrestrial source. It was a deliberate transmission from a point in low Earth orbit, encoded in standard digital protocol, received by a high-gain array pointed precisely at its origin, and it contained a syntactically correct English sentence that expressed, with admirable economy, 3 distinct pieces of information. Confirmation of presence, statement of intent. The note that Dr. Elara Voss wrote at the top of the fresh page was not, as she would later reflect, particularly eloquent. It was 3 words, written in capital letters, underlined twice, with the kind of pressure that leaves an impression on the page beneath. It read, "Verify before acting." It was the first principle of scientific method applied to the most unscientific moment of her life, and writing it steadied her hands and slowed her breathing and gave her something to hold on to while the rest of her mind processed what her monitor was still displaying in clean, unambiguous digital text. "We are here. We mean no harm. Do not share this signal. More to follow." She read it 6 times. She read it the way you read something when your brain keeps sliding off the surface of the words because the implications beneath them are too large to absorb all at once. She ran a signal analysis on the transmission, frequency, modulation, encoding format, signal strength, angle of incidence. And the results were exactly what she had expected them to be and exactly what she had been hoping they would not be, because hope, in her experience, was the enemy of rigorous analysis, and she had been trying for 30 years to keep hope and analysis in separate rooms of her mind, and right now they had broken down the door between them and were standing in the same space staring at each other. The signal was real. It was not interference. It was not a natural phenomenon dressed up in digital encoding. It was not a reflection artifact or a system malfunction or a misidentified terrestrial source. It was a deliberate transmission from a point in low Earth orbit, encoded in standard digital protocol, received by a high-gain array pointed precisely at its origin, and it contained a syntactically correct English sentence that expressed, with admirable economy, 3 distinct pieces of information. Confirmation of presence, statement of intent. And a request for discretion followed by a promise of further communication. It was, in short, the most information-dense 1.3 seconds of electromagnetic radiation in the history of her field. And she was the only person on Earth who had received it. She sat with that for a moment. The weight of it was extraordinary, not the weight of the message itself, though that was considerable, but the specific weight of being alone with it. Of being the only person in 7 billion who knew, with the kind of certainty that 3 independent analyses and a direct signal confirmation provided, that the thing in the sky was real and was aware of her and had chosen, out of all the possible recipients on the planet's surface, to respond to her specifically. She thought about why. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn a stone to look at what lives underneath, examining it from different angles, testing the explanations. They had responded to her scan. She had been the one scanning them. She had been awake, she had been pointed at the right piece of sky, she had been using a high-gain array rather than military radar, and perhaps most importantly, she had been operating alone, outside of any institutional or governmental chain of command, with no immediate obligation to report upward. Do not share this signal. They had known, or inferred, or calculated, that she was operating independently. That a response to her scan carried different risks than a response to a military installation. That a scientist at a research institute at 3 in the morning was a different kind of contact point than a defense analyst in a classified facility. She wrote all of this down. She wrote it in the careful, structured language of a scientific log, because that was the framework she had for processing extraordinary things, and because she understood instinctively that whatever happened next, the record mattered. She was aware, as she wrote, of a particular irony, that the discipline she was applying to this moment was the same discipline she had spent 30 years applying to the absence of this moment, and that the skills she had developed waiting for contact were now, unexpectedly, the skills she needed to manage it. She finished the log entry. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the message still sitting on the display in its clean, straightforward text. More to follow. She adjusted her equipment. She settled into her chair. She did not call anyone. She did not leave the building. She refilled her coffee from the machine in the corner of the lab, which produced something that was technically coffee in the same way that a ship's ration bar was technically food, and she came back to her workstation and she waited. The decision to send a second transmission had not been made lightly, and Voss had not made it alone. She had convened an emergency session in the briefing room that had lasted 2 hours and had involved, at various points, raised voices, a significant amount of technical cross-referencing, one moment where Torres had stood up and paced the length of the room twice before sitting back down without saying anything, and a philosophical argument between Patel and Webb that had started as a discussion about timeline contamination risk and had gradually revealed itself to be, underneath the technical language, a much older argument about whether the people of this period deserved to know the truth about their own future. Webb had argued, with the passionate pragmatism of a physician who had spent his career treating the consequences of ignorance, that a civilization on the verge of the conflicts this period's historical record described was precisely the kind of civilization that needed information. That the Prime Directive had been written for pre-warp civilizations encountering alien life for the first time, not for a pre-warp civilization encountering its own descendants. That there was a meaningful ethical distinction between interference and assistance, and that the Federation's founding philosophy, the one that the Temporal Prime Directive was theoretically designed to protect, was itself built on the premise that knowledge and contact and connection were goods, not threats. Patel had argued, with the precise, controlled urgency of someone who had spent her career studying what happened when well-intentioned people decided that the rules didn't apply to their specific situation, that the historical record existed and showed containment and that was not a coincidence, and that the path from a narrowband text message to a civilization-altering disclosure was shorter and less controllable than anyone sitting in this room wanted to believe, and that the amber zones in her model were amber because the situation was still recoverable and she intended to keep it that way. Voss had listened to both of them. She had listened to Torres's security concerns and Vasquez's engineering timeline and Okafor's communications analysis. She had sat at the head of the table and she had thought about the question mark at the end of the sub-branch and the word contained in the archival record and the image of a scientist alone in a lab in the middle of the night who had done the work herself and found the answer and then, instead of going to the government or the press or any of the institutional structures that would have immediately amplified the information beyond any possibility of management, had pointed a radio telescope at the sky and listened. That choice mattered. The discretion embedded in that choice mattered. The judgment it reflected, the understanding that this was not a moment for institutions but for individuals, not for broadcast but for dialogue, was not the judgment of someone who needed to be protected from the truth. It was the judgment of someone who might, with careful handling, be trusted with it. We send one more message, Voss had said, at the end of the 2 hours. Narrowband, text only, minimum power, same protocols as the first. We establish a communication channel with this individual and we assess. We do not disclose our nature, our origin, or our timeline. We gather information about what she knows, what she has shared, and what the risk landscape actually looks like from the surface. She had looked at Patel. The probability model is running on incomplete information. Every piece of data we can gather about the current situation on the surface makes the model more accurate and our decision-making better. That is not interference. That is intelligence. Patel had not agreed. But she had accepted it in the way that a good officer accepts a command decision, not silently, not without registering her objection for the record, but with the professional understanding that the commander had heard the argument and made a different call and that the job now was to make the call work. The second message read, "You are correct in your analysis. You are the only person on Earth receiving this transmission. We require your discretion for reasons that will become clear. Please respond on the frequency you use to contact us. We will receive it." Amara had responded within 4 minutes, which told Voss something important about her state of readiness. The response was measured, precise, and revealed, in the careful architecture of its sentences, the mind of someone who had been preparing questions for 30 years and was now deploying them with the focused efficiency of a person who understood that the opportunity might be limited. She asked, "How many of you are there? What do you want? How long have you been here? Are there others?" 4 questions. Prioritized in a specific order that Voss found, when she analyzed it, genuinely illuminating. Not who are you? Not where are you from? Not the existential questions that dominated human cultural imaginings of this moment. Instead, operational questions. Situational awareness questions. The questions of someone who had processed the existential shock and moved past it into the practical dimension, who understood that what mattered right now was not the philosophical enormity of the situation but the specific, immediate, actionable parameters of it. Voss drafted the response herself, choosing each word with the care of someone laying tiles in a pattern that needed to hold weight. She answered the questions in order, with the same economy that Amara had used, because she had already decided that the register of this communication would be set by the person on the other end of it, and the person on the other end had set it at precise and professional and without ornamentation. The response read, "We are a crew of many. We want to go home without causing harm to you or your world. We have been here for less than 1 day. There are no others that we are aware of. We are not a threat. We are, in a sense that will require more time to explain properly, familiar with your world. We ask for your patience and your continued discretion. There are people who must not know about this communication." She sent it. She waited. 40 seconds passed. Then a minute. Then 3 minutes, which was longer than the previous response time by enough of a margin to suggest that the message had landed differently than the first 2. Had opened something up rather than simply answering a question, and that the person on the other end was sitting with it in the way that you sit with something that has changed the shape of what you thought you understood. The response, when it came, was a single sentence. It read, "When you say familiar with my world, how familiar do you mean?" Voss looked at the message on Okafor's display for a long time. She thought about everything that answer implied, the intelligence of it, the precision of it, the way it had cut directly to the thread that, if pulled, would unravel everything. She thought about the Temporal Prime Directive and the timeline and the amber zones and the 4 days until the geomagnetic storm and the 17 days until the fold closed permanently. She thought about watchful and what contained meant and whether the plan she was executing right now was the plan that had always been executed, written into the historical record in the gaps and redactions and the careful classified silence of a program that had been terminated and contained and never fully explained. She thought about what happened if she told the truth and what happened if she didn't and whether, in a situation this recursive, that distinction had any meaning left. Then she drafted her response. She wrote it slowly, more slowly than the previous messages, with the particular care of someone who understands that the words they are choosing will not stay only in the place they are sent but will ripple outward through time in ways that cannot be fully predicted or controlled or taken back. It read, Familiar enough to know that your world survives what is coming. Familiar enough to tell you that the decisions made by individuals in the next several decades matter more than your historians will ever be permitted to record. We cannot tell you more than this without risking harm to the very future we come from. But we want you to understand, what you are doing right now, alone in that building, with those notes on that legal pad, is exactly the kind of thing that makes the future worth coming from. She sent it before she could reconsider. The transmission lasted 1.7 seconds. In a lab in California, a scientist read it 3 times. Then she set down her pen for the first time in hours. She looked at the monitor for a long moment. She looked at her notes, 4 pages of precise, methodical documentation of the most significant event in human history, sitting on a legal pad on a desk in a building that most people on Earth had never heard of, known to exactly one person. Then, very slowly, Dr. Amara Osei began to cry. Not from fear, and not entirely from joy, but from the specific, overwhelming relief of someone who has spent 30 years being right about something that the world kept telling her was probably wrong, and has finally, in the middle of the night in an empty lab with cold coffee and headphones and 30 years of prepared questions, been told that she was right. She wiped her eyes. She picked up her pen. She turned to a new page. She wrote, at the top, in capital letters, underlined twice. Do not share. Not yet. Then she settled back into her chair, adjusted her headphones, and waited for more to follow. The geomagnetic storm arrived ahead of schedule. This was not, in itself, unusual. Solar weather was among the least predictable of the natural phenomena that Starfleet's meteorological databases tracked, and the historical record had always carried a margin of variance around the October 2025 G3 event that Vasquez had built into her engineering timeline precisely because she was the kind of chief engineer who planned for the margin rather than assuming it away. What was unusual? What elevated the early arrival from an inconvenience to a genuine operational complication, was the magnitude. The historical record described a G3 event, which on the planetary geomagnetic disturbance scale represented a strong storm capable of producing power grid fluctuations at high latitudes and generating visible auroral displays as far south as the northern United States. What the Meridian sensors were now tracking as the leading edge of the solar plasma cloud swept through the inner system was something considerably more energetic than that. G4 at minimum, Vasquez said, standing at the engineering console on the bridge with the expression of someone rapidly revising a plan that had been very carefully constructed around a specific set of assumptions. Possibly borderline G5. The coronal mass ejection was larger than the historical record indicated. The archival data appears to have been based on ground observations that underestimated the plasma density in the leading edge. She pulled up the revised modeling on the main view screen. The good news is that the electromagnetic background noise generated by a G4 event is significantly greater than what we calculated for a G3. Our reopening pulse becomes even less distinguishable against that background. And the bad news, Voss said, from the command chair. The storm makes subspace field propagation significantly more turbulent. The preconditioning process we've been running for the past 2 days has been proceeding in relatively calm conditions. A G4 geomagnetic storm introduces variability into the quantum signature of the fold that could complicate the preconditioning geometry. Vasquez chose the word complicated with the precision of an engineer who meant something considerably more alarming by it but was choosing her language carefully in front of the full bridge crew. I need to recalculate the preconditioning parameters against the revised storm profile. I'll have an updated timeline within 6 hours. You have 4, Voss said. The storm's leading edge hits in approximately 8 hours. I want to know what we're doing before it arrives. Vasquez nodded and was already moving toward the turbolift. Voss turned back to the view screen. The main display had been split for the past 31 hours between the orbital sensor picture and the public broadcast feed that Torres's team maintained as a continuous monitor of the surface situation. The two halves of the screen had developed, over that time, a relationship that Voss found increasingly difficult to look away from. The clean tactical geometry of the orbital picture on one side, the churning human complexity of the broadcast feed on the other, and between them the implicit question of how long those two realities could coexist without colliding. The surface situation had evolved in ways that were both predictable and not. The predictable dimension was the institutional response. The government statements, the official explanations, the careful public messaging designed to maintain order while the classified investigation continued behind it. The United States had issued a statement through its space agency characterizing the radar anomaly as a sensor artifact caused by unusual atmospheric conditions, a characterization that was technically unfalsifiable and had been accepted by a significant portion of the population with the relieved credulity of people who very much wanted a mundane explanation and were prepared to accept one that was offered with sufficient authority. Several Allied governments had issued supporting statements. The story, in its official form, was being managed. The unofficial form was considerably more difficult to manage. Because the world of 2025 did not have a single information environment that could be controlled through official channels. It had thousands of information environments, each with its own logic and its own immune response to official narratives, and the people who inhabited those environments had spent the better part of 2 decades developing a sophisticated and entirely warranted skepticism toward institutional explanations of anomalous events. The aerospace engineers who had analyzed the radar return data were not going away. The independent researchers cross-referencing the signal characteristics against known spacecraft databases were not going away. The retired military officials speaking carefully on background to journalists were not going away. And the footage. There was footage now, from 3 separate amateur astronomers who had been tracking the orbital path identified in the leaked radar data and had captured, in the hours before the cloak had fully stabilized, faint but unambiguous visual returns on long-exposure astrophotography equipment, was not going away. The footage was not clear. It was not the kind of unambiguous visual confirmation that would end the debate definitively. But it was real, and it was consistent across 3 independent sources, and it showed something in low Earth orbit that was large and dark and moving in a way that no known spacecraft moved. It had been shared approximately 40 million times in the past 18 hours. Torres pulled up the latest signals intelligence summary from his monitoring team. Military communication traffic has increased another 30% in the last 6 hours. We're tracking coordinated activity between at least 6 national defense agencies, US, UK, France, Russia, China, India. They're not sharing information freely with each other, but they're all responding to the same event. He highlighted a cluster of frequency bands on the tactical display. We're also seeing increased activity on frequencies consistent with directed energy research facilities. 4 separate installations in 3 countries have redirected equipment toward our orbital track in the last 12 hours. Directed energy, Voss said carefully. Nothing in the current technological baseline that could threaten the ship, Torres said, and his tone carried the particular weight of a qualifier that was doing a lot of work. At current power levels and beam coherence, their directed energy platforms couldn't penetrate our shields at any meaningful level. But they're scanning. Learning. And some of what they're doing looks less like scanning and more like ranging, establishing precise distance and position data for our location. He paused. They're building a targeting picture, Commander. They can't hit us yet. But they're laying the groundwork. Voss absorbed this. How long before that changes? Before their capabilities close the gap enough to represent a genuine threat to the ship? At current development rates? Torres shook his head. Years. Decades. We'll be home long before that's relevant. He hesitated in the specific way that meant the next part of his answer was the part he had been deciding how to phrase. The concern isn't their current capabilities, Commander. It's their intentions. 6 national militaries coordinating a response to an unidentified object in low orbit, building targeting data, operating on the assumption that the object is adversarial. He looked at her directly. At some point, one of those agencies makes a decision that doesn't require their technology to work perfectly. It just requires them to commit to the attempt. And that decision creates a situation where we have to respond. And our response options are all bad, Voss finished. Every one of them. We break cloak to defend ourselves, we're visible to the entire planet. We use weapons, we're a threat. We absorb the hit and do nothing, we lose systems and potentially the ability to execute the fold reopening. He spread his hands. There is no good outcome on that branch of the decision tree. Voss stood up and walked to the center of the bridge. She stood there for a moment, looking at the split view screen. The orbital picture, the broadcast feed, the geomagnetic storm data in the corner that Vasquez had added to the display before she left, its angry red gradient advancing steadily toward the inner system like a weather front with ambitions. She thought about Elara. The communication channel they had established had been active for 30 hours now, and it had evolved in ways that Voss had not entirely anticipated. The initial exchanges had been cautious and carefully bounded. Voss answering questions with the minimum necessary information, Elara asking questions that were increasingly precise and increasingly difficult to deflect without either lying or revealing more than was safe. But somewhere in the middle hours of the previous night, the character of the conversation had shifted. The questions had become less interrogative and more collaborative. Elara had stopped trying to extract information and started offering it instead, surface intelligence, gathered through her own monitoring of the institutional response, the kind of ground-level situational awareness that the Meridian sensors could approximate but not replicate. She had described the government coordination. She had described the footage circulating online. She had described the internal debate she knew was happening inside SETI and the broader scientific community between the people who believed the evidence and the people who needed not to believe it and the people who believed it but understood that believing it publicly carried consequences that the evidence alone did not justify. She had described all of this with the focused, dispassionate clarity of a scientist filing a report, and Voss had read each transmission and thought about the extraordinary thing that was happening. That a woman in a lab in California, alone with a legal pad and 30 years of preparation, had become, through the specific combination of her skills and her judgment and her discretion and the accident of being awake at the right moment with the right equipment pointed at the right piece of sky, the most important individual on Earth relative to the Meridian situation. Not because of any institutional power she held, but because she was the bridge between two realities that needed, for the next 4 days, to remain carefully separated, and she had chosen to be that bridge with full understanding of what it cost. The latest transmission from Elara had arrived 40 minutes ago. Voss pulled it up on her command chair display and read it again. It read, "The government explanation is holding publicly but not privately. I have been contacted by 2 colleagues in the past 12 hours who reached their own conclusions independently. I told them nothing. I am maintaining the channel as you asked. But I need you to understand that the window of individual discretion is finite. The institutional machinery is moving. More people will reach the same conclusions I did. Some of them will not exercise the same judgment. You have days, not weeks, before this becomes uncontainable through individual action alone. I am not telling you this to pressure you. I am telling you this because you said the decisions of individuals matter. I am an individual making a decision right now. I think you should know the landscape it is being made in." Voss had read it 6 times since it arrived and each reading had reinforced the same conclusion, that Elara was right, and that the information she was providing was exactly the kind of ground truth intelligence that the probability model needed, and that the picture it was painting was of a situation that was moving faster than Vasquez's engineering timeline and more unpredictably than Patel's model had accounted for. She went to her ready room. She sat at her desk. She composed a response carefully, running it through the same weighing process she applied to every transmission. What does this reveal? What does this risk? What does this person need to know to keep making good decisions on the ground? She sent it. It read, "You are right about the timeline. We are working to resolve our situation within the next 48 to 72 hours. The storm approaching your planet will assist us. After we are gone, there will be no signal, no ship, no evidence beyond what already exists. What happens with that evidence is a decision your world will make for itself. We cannot make it for you. But I want to tell you something that falls outside the boundaries of what I am permitted to share, and I am choosing to share it anyway because you have earned it with 30 hours of judgment that I did not have the right to ask for and that you gave freely. The gap in your historical record, the classified program, the contained files, the redactions that were never lifted, that gap was kept because the people who filled it understood that some knowledge changes the people who hold it in ways that cannot be undone. You are going to spend the rest of your life holding this. I am sorry for the weight of it. And I am grateful beyond what these protocols allow me to express. She sent it. She sat back in her chair. Through the ready room's small viewport, she could see the first faint auroral shimmer beginning to appear at the limb of Earth's atmosphere as the storm's leading edge began its interaction with the planet's magnetosphere, pale green and violet, beautiful and violent and completely indifferent to the humans looking up at it from the surface below. She thought about 48 hours. She thought about Vasquez's recalculations and Torres's targeting picture and Patel's amber zones and the 6 national militaries that were building a picture of something they could not yet reach. She thought about what happened if any one of those variables resolved in the wrong direction before the fold opened. Then she went back to the bridge, because that was where she needed to be, and she sat in the command chair, and she watched the storm come in. The geomagnetic storm made the aurora visible from San Francisco. Amara saw it through the lab's north-facing window at 11:47 p.m., a soft, trembling curtain of green and violet hanging above the city's light pollution like something that had been placed there specifically to be looked at, which she understood intellectually was not the case and felt emotionally was exactly true. She had seen auroras before, on a research trip to Iceland a decade ago, standing in a frozen field with a thermos of something hot and the particular silence of a landscape that has decided to be extraordinary for a while. She had found them beautiful in the way that large natural phenomena are beautiful, incomprehensibly, impersonally, in a way that makes the observer feel small and fortunate simultaneously. This one felt different. This one felt like a message. She knew, from the transmissions over the past 2 days, that the storm was connected to their plan. She did not know the specifics. The technical details of what the storm's electromagnetic background would be used to cover had not been shared with her, and she had not asked, because she understood that there were things she was better off not knowing in precise detail and that the discipline of not asking was itself a form of trust being offered in both directions. But she knew the storm mattered. She knew the next 48 hours mattered. And she was standing at the window watching the sky light up green and violet over the city and feeling, for the first time in 32 hours of sustained tension, something that was almost peace. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was her colleague Dr. Elara Voss, calling from the Institute's Tucson affiliate. Third call in 18 hours. Amara had let the first 2 go to voicemail and had listened to the messages with the careful attention of someone assessing a threat landscape. Renata's voice carrying the specific quality of scientific excitement that Amara recognized because she had heard it in her own voice, years ago, when she had first begun to understand that the candidate signals her field dismissed were being dismissed too quickly. Renata had run her own analysis. She had reached her own conclusions. Her second voicemail had contained a frequency reference that was only 4 decimal places away from the channel Amara was using, which meant she was close, which meant the window that Amara had described to the ship was closing faster than even she had estimated. She let the third call go to voicemail. She went back to her workstation. She sat down. She looked at the monitor where the channel remained open. A thin thread of light between 2 points that were separated by 340 years and a few hundred kilometers of atmosphere, maintained by the discipline of 2 people who understood that thin threads, handled carefully, could hold extraordinary weight. She typed, "The aurora is visible from my location. I understand this means you are close. I want you to know that I have maintained the channel as agreed. One colleague is very close to the same frequency. I have not confirmed anything. But I need to ask you something that I have been not asking for 32 hours because I was not sure I had the right to ask it." She paused. She looked at what she had written. Then she typed, "Do you know if we make it? Not specifically. Not names or dates. Just, do the people of this time, in this decade, make it through what is coming? I have read the history that is available to me. I know what the projections say. I spend a great deal of my professional life trying to believe that the answer is yes. I would like to know if that belief is justified. She sent it. She put her hands flat on the desk. She looked at the aurora through the window. She waited. Voss read the message on the bridge display and felt something move through her chest that was not quite grief and not quite hope but occupied the same neighborhood as both. She had been asked versions of this question before. In the abstract, in academic contexts, in the philosophical discussions that temporal science officers inevitably generated at senior staff dinners when the conversation turned, as it always did eventually, to what it meant to carry the knowledge of how history unfolded. She had always engaged with those discussions from a comfortable analytical distance, the distance of someone for whom the question was theoretical. It was not theoretical now. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what the history book said about this decade and the one that followed, the grinding, costly, incremental work of a civilization pulling itself back from the edges it had approached. The wars that were smaller than they might have been. The agreements that held, imperfectly, longer than the pessimists had predicted. The scientific breakthroughs that arrived just late enough to feel miraculous and just early enough to matter. The slow, painful, generational work of building the institutional foundations that would eventually, after more suffering than any of the people doing that work would live to see the end of, become something worth traveling back in time from. She thought about the fact that she existed. That her crew existed. That the ship around her existed. That the Federation existed. That all of it, every piece of the future she had grown up in and trained for and sworn to protect, was downstream of the choices made by the people on the planet below her in exactly this period, in exactly these decades, by exactly the kind of individuals who looked at an impossible situation and chose. Against the institutional gravity pulling them toward silence and compliance and the comfortable fiction of the mundane, to pay attention and tell the truth and keep faith with the possibility that things could be better. She thought about Elara, alone in that lab for 32 hours, holding the weight of the most significant secret in human history with the discipline of someone who understood that the weight was not hers to put down yet. She composed her response. She wrote it in the direct, unornamented register that had characterized all of their exchanges, because that register was the one Elara had set and the one that had carried truth most cleanly between them. It read, yes. Not easily. Not without cost that I cannot describe to you because the description would do more harm than the uncertainty. But yes. The people of your time make choices in the next several decades that are, from where I stand, the foundation of everything. I am not permitted to tell you this. I am telling you anyway because you asked directly and you have earned a direct answer and because the Temporal Prime Directive, whatever its wisdom, was not written for a moment quite like this one. Your world survives. More than survives. What it becomes is worth the cost of getting there. I need you to believe that not because it will make the cost smaller but because people who believe it make better decisions than people who don't. You are one of those people. You have been one of those people for 30 years without any evidence to support it. You have that evidence now. Use it. She sent it. She sat back. She looked at the view screen. The storm had arrived in full force 2 hours ago, and its effect on the electromagnetic environment was everything Vasquez had revised her calculations to account for and more. The background noise across every sensor band was extraordinary, a roiling, dynamic interference field that blanketed the orbital environment in the kind of electromagnetic turbulence that made precise sensor work genuinely difficult even for the Meridian systems, and would make it effectively impossible for any ground-based detection platform operating at current technological levels. The auroral displays were visible across the entire northern hemisphere. Radio communications were disrupted from Scandinavia to Alaska. Satellite navigation systems were registering significant positioning errors. 3 national power grids had implemented precautionary load reductions. And somewhere in the lower decks, Vasquez was running the final preconditioning sequence on the quantum fold, her revised calculations mapped precisely to the storm's magnetic field geometry, her engineering team moving through their checklist with the focused efficiency of people who understood that the margin for error in the next 6 hours was narrow and the consequences of exceeding it were permanent. Preconditioning sequence at 73%, Vasquez reported over the intercom, her voice carrying the particular quality of concentrated attention. Field geometry is holding within acceptable variance parameters. The storm's magnetic gradient is actually helping, the fold's quantum signature is responding to the background energy in ways that are accelerating the preconditioning timeline. A pause. We may be ready to attempt the reopening pulse earlier than the revised estimate. How much earlier? Voss asked. 4 hours instead of 6, if the sequence continues at current rate. Another pause, longer. Commander, I want to flag something. The fold's response to the storm energy is unexpected. Not alarming, but unexpected. The quantum signature is showing resonance patterns that don't match the standard model for a naturally occurring subspace fold. They're more consistent with, she stopped. With what, Commander Vasquez? With a fold that has been deliberately structured. Not natural. Engineered. Her voice was careful in the way that careful voices are when the speaker is presenting a conclusion they have checked multiple times because they did not want it to be the conclusion. The geometry is too precise. Natural subspace folds have characteristic irregularities. Asymmetries in the quantum signature that reflect the random processes that formed them. This one doesn't have those irregularities. It's clean. It's been built to specific tolerances. The bridge was quiet. Voss looked at the view screen. She thought about what Patel had said in the ready room before the first senior staff meeting, the thing about the probability modeling and the confidence interval and the word that Patel had used. Pulled. Not pushed. Who could have built it, she asked. In this time period? Vasquez's voice carried the answer before she said it. No one. The technology required is several centuries beyond anything available on the surface. A pause. But from our time period, or beyond it. It's possible, Voss said. It's possible, Vasquez confirmed. Voss stood up. She walked to the center of the bridge. She looked at her crew. Okafor at Ops, Tyrell at Con, Torres at Tactical, each of them processing what Vasquez had just reported with varying degrees of visible consternation. She looked at the storm on the view screen, the aurora painting the limb of the planet in colors that were beautiful and violent and precisely timed. Precisely timed. She thought about the historical record and its gaps. She thought about watchful and contained. She thought about the probability model and the question mark at the end of the subbranch that accounted for the possibility that the meridian was not the only variable in this situation. She thought about the fold that had not pushed them here but pulled them, and that had now revealed itself to be not a natural accident but a constructed pathway, built to tolerances that implied intention, built by someone with technology that did not exist in this century. She thought about what all of those things implied when you put them together. What picture they formed when you stopped looking at each piece individually and looked at the whole. Someone had built a door. Someone had opened it at a specific moment and in a specific location and had waited for the Meridian's experimental drive to intersect with its quantum signature. Someone had arranged for a Federation starship to be deposited in low Earth orbit above a specific planet at a specific point in that planet's history, with a 17-day window to go home, long enough to do something, short enough to prevent anything irreversible. Someone had needed them here. Okafor, she said, with the calm of a commander who has arrived at a conclusion that changes everything and is choosing, for the moment, to hold it steady rather than let it detonate. Open the channel to the surface. I need to send a message to Dr. Osei. Okafor opened the channel. Voss composed the message standing at the center of the bridge, thinking through each word with the care she had applied to every transmission, but this time with an additional layer of consideration. Because this message was not about managing the situation. It was about understanding it. It read, "I need to ask you something that I have not asked in 32 hours of conversation. You have described the institutional response to our presence with significant detail and consistent accuracy. You have described developments before my sensors confirmed them. You have maintained a channel that other individuals with equivalent analytical capability have approached and been turned away from. I do not believe that is entirely coincidence. I need to know, is there anything about your involvement in this situation that you have not told me? Anything about why you were awake at that specific hour, with that specific equipment, pointed at that specific piece of sky? Anything about what led you to this moment?" She sent it. She waited. The response took 11 minutes, which was the longest delay in any exchange they had shared, and when it came, it was different in character from every previous transmission. Not in its precision, which remained, but in the quality beneath the precision, in the register that carried the weight of something that had been held back and was now, after 32 hours of extraordinary discipline, being let go. It read, "I received an anonymous communication 14 months ago. Encrypted, untraceable, delivered through a channel I did not know existed and have not been able to identify since. It contained a date, a time, a frequency, and a set of scan parameters. It contained no explanation and no sender identification. I spent 14 months deciding whether to follow the instructions or ignore them. I am a scientist. I follow data. I followed the instructions. I did not know what I was looking for. I knew only that someone, somewhere, had decided I needed to be looking." Voss read it twice. Then she looked up at the view screen, at the storm, at the aurora, at the planet turning below with its 7 billion people and its wars and its hope and its 48 years until the moment when a man named Zephram Cochrane would light a plasma torch and change everything. She thought about the door. She thought about who had built it. She thought about anonymous communications and untraceable channels and the specific, surgical precision of an intervention that had placed one scientist at one piece of equipment at one moment in history and placed one starship directly above her. She thought about what it meant that someone in the future, her future, or beyond it, had needed this to happen and had arranged for it to happen and had trusted, with the quiet confidence of someone who knew how the story ended, that the people involved would make the right decisions when the moment came. She thought about all of that. She held it. She let it settle. Then she went to find Patel, because whatever came next, she needed the temporal science officer to understand what they were actually inside. Patel listened without interrupting, which was itself a form of communication. Voss had known her long enough to understand that the temporal science officer's silences were not passive. They were active, structured, the outward expression of a mind that was processing incoming information against a framework of existing analysis and revising, in real time, everything that needed revising. She sat across the desk in Voss's ready room with her hands flat on the table and her eyes focused on a point slightly above and behind Voss's left shoulder, which was where she tended to look when she was running the most intensive calculations, as if the answer she needed was written on the air just out of frame and she was working to bring it into focus. Voss laid it out completely. The engineered fold. Vasquez's analysis of the quantum signature tolerances. The anonymous communication to Amara 14 months ago, the date, the time, the frequency, the scan parameters delivered through a channel that could not be identified or traced. The precise timing of the storm. The probability models ? The word pulled. She put all of it on the table and then she stopped talking and let Patel's silence do its work. It took 4 minutes. Voss timed it without meaning to. Then Patel said, very quietly, temporal intervention. That's my read, Voss said. Someone from a point sufficiently advanced beyond our own timeline, our own future, or a parallel branch of it, constructed the fold deliberately. Positioned it to intersect with the Meridian's drive signature at a specific moment. Planted the information that brought Dr. Osei to her equipment at the correct time. Timed the coronal mass ejection, or selected a naturally occurring one and built the window around it. Patel paused. This was not an accident. None of it was an accident. We were placed here. By someone who needed us here, Voss said. Someone who knew what we would do when we arrived. Who trusted us to establish the channel with OSE, to maintain the Temporal Prime Directive's core constraints, to execute the fold reopening without contaminating the timeline beyond the Type 2 threshold. She leaned forward. Someone who knew the outcome. Which means the outcome is fixed, Patel said. And then, with the careful precision of a scientist who understood the implications of what she was saying, or was fixed. From their perspective. She looked at Voss directly for the first time since the briefing had begun. Commander, if this was a deliberate temporal intervention, then the entity or entities responsible had access to our timeline at a level of resolution that implies either direct observation of our decisions or predictive modeling of extraordinary sophistication. They knew we would be here. They knew we would make the choices we made. They knew OSE would maintain the channel. She paused. They also knew we would reach this conclusion. And they did it anyway, Voss said. And they did it anyway, Patel agreed. Which means that our knowing doesn't change the outcome. Or they calculated that it wouldn't. She was quiet for a moment. Or they needed us to know. The revelation is part of the design. Voss stood up and went to the viewport. The storm was at peak intensity now, the aurora a continuous luminous curtain across the entire visible arc of Earth's atmosphere, green and violet and occasionally a deep, arterial red where the plasma density was highest. It was extraordinary to look at. It was the kind of thing that made you aware, in a way that was difficult to articulate and impossible to dismiss, of how small any individual moment was against the scale of the processes that produced it. Solar wind and magnetic field and atmospheric chemistry combining across 93 million miles of space to paint light on the edge of a planet. She thought about scale. She thought about what it implied that an entity operating at the level of sophistication required to engineer a temporal fold and seed the conditions for a specific sequence of events had chosen, as the instrument of whatever they were trying to accomplish. A single Federation starship crewed by 140 people who had been in the middle of a routine mission when the universe reached back 3.5 centuries and collected them. What do they want? She said, not entirely as a question. More as the final piece of the analysis that she was putting together in real time, needing to hear it said aloud to test whether it held together. I've been sitting with that since you started talking, Patel said. And I keep coming back to the same answer, which I don't entirely like because it's uncomfortable, but the data points to it consistently. She pulled up her probability model on the ready room's small display, navigating to the subbranch with the question mark. The question mark isn't uncertainty about outcome. It's a placeholder for a variable that the model couldn't identify because I didn't have sufficient information to define it. She highlighted the branch. The variable is Dr. OSE. Specifically, what she does after we leave. Voss turned from the viewport. She's going to spend the rest of her life holding this, Patel said, echoing Voss's own transmission back at her. Your words. You said them because they were true. She will hold it, the knowledge, the evidence, the record she has been keeping on that legal pad for 32 hours. And she will make decisions about what to do with it. When to share it. With whom? In what form? Those decisions. Made by one person, over years and decades, informed by 32 hours of direct communication with a Federation starship, those decisions are downstream events in the historical record of this period. She looked at Voss steadily. The gap in the historical record. The classified files that were never fully declassified. Watchful, terminated and contained. The foundational documents of the SETI Institute's strategic research priorities in the late 2020s and 2030s, which historians have noted were unusually prescient about the direction of pre-contact preparation but have never been able to explain in terms of the information available at the time. She paused. Commander, I think Dr. OSE is in the historical record. Not as a public figure. Not in a way that was ever fully visible. But in the decisions she made and the work she did and the way she shaped, quietly and over a long period, the institutional and scientific groundwork that made first contact possible when it happened. The ready room was very quiet. Through the viewport, the aurora pulsed. And someone in our future needed that to happen correctly, Voss said. Needed it to happen at all, Patel said. Or needed it to happen differently than it was going to happen without intervention. Perhaps in the original timeline, without this encounter, Osei's work took a different direction. Perhaps the pre-contact preparation was insufficient. Perhaps something went wrong in the period between now and Cochrane's flight that this encounter was designed to prevent, or mitigate, or correct. She spread her hands. I can't know that. The model can't reach that far with the data we have. But the architecture of what we're inside is consistent with a targeted correction, a minimal intervention designed to introduce one specific variable into the historical development of this period. Us, Voss said. Dr. Osei, Patel said. We are the mechanism. She is the variable. Voss sat back down at her desk. She looked at the display, at the probability model, at the branch that had been a question mark and was now something she could see clearly, not a gap in the analysis but the point where the design revealed itself, where the architecture of the intervention showed its purpose in the way that an arch reveals its purpose when you finally see the keystone. She thought about what this meant for the next 6 hours. For the fold reopening. For the transmission she needed to send before they left. Because she was going to send one more transmission. She had known it since Patel said the word variable and the architecture clicked into place. There was something Amara needed to know, not the full truth of what had been arranged and by whom, because Voss did not have that truth and would not speculate about it in a transmission that would live in Amara's notes for the rest of her life. But something. A frame. A way of understanding what had happened to her and why she had been chosen and what the 32 hours of discipline she had exercised had been in service of. She owed her that. Vasquez, she said over the intercom. Status on the preconditioning sequence. 91%, Vasquez responded immediately, as if she had been waiting for the question. Commander, the fold's resonance with the storm energy is, I don't have a better word than beautiful. The quantum signature is fully primed. We are ahead of schedule. A pause. I want to run one final diagnostic pass before I declare us ready for the reopening pulse. 40 minutes, maximum. You have 30, Voss said. We execute when you're done. Understood. She looked at Patel. I need you on the bridge for the reopening sequence. I need your hands on the temporal variance readings personally, not delegated. If anything in the fold's behavior during the pulse suggests a deviation from the designed parameters, I need to know in real time. Patel nodded. She was already standing. Commander, she said, at the door. The entity that built this. Whoever they are, whatever point in our future they're operating from, they chose us specifically. The Meridian. Our crew. Our specific configuration of skills and judgment and, she paused, choosing the word carefully. Character. They built the door and they put us in front of it and they trusted us to walk through it correctly. She looked at Voss directly. I think we have. She left. Voss sat alone in the ready room for 90 seconds, which was all she permitted herself, and thought about trust extended across centuries and the specific, irreducible importance of individual decisions made in the dark without anyone watching except the people who had already seen how it ended. Then she opened the channel to the surface and composed the final transmission. She wrote it in the same clean, unornamented register as everything that had preceded it, because consistency was itself a form of honesty, and because the register had carried truth reliably across 32 hours and she was not going to change it for the most important message in the sequence. It read, "We are leaving within the hour. The storm gives us the cover we need and the window is closing. I want to tell you several things before we go, and I want to be as honest as I can within the constraints I have been operating under, because you have earned honesty and I am no longer certain those constraints serve the purpose they were designed to serve in a situation like this one. First, you were not found by accident. The encounter between us was arranged by someone operating from a point in time beyond my own. I do not know who they are or the full extent of what they intended. I know that they chose you specifically. They sent you instructions 14 months ago because they knew you would be the right person for this moment, not because of your credentials, though those matter, but because of your judgment. The discipline you exercised in the past 32 hours was not incidental to the design. It was the design. You were chosen because someone from our future knew you would hold this correctly. Second, the work you do from this point forward matters in ways that will not be visible to you while you are doing it. I cannot tell you specifically what that work is or should be. I can tell you that the historical record of this period, the gaps in it, the classified files, the research priorities that historians will later describe as unusually prescient, those traces are yours. You leave them. Not loudly. Not in a way that breaks the world open before it is ready. But persistently, carefully, over years and decades, in the work of someone who knows what is coming and chooses to prepare the ground for it rather than announce it. Third, the answer to the question you asked is yes. I told you that already. I am telling you again because I want it to be the last thing I say to you. Yes. Your world makes it. The cost is real and I cannot minimize it. But what is built on the other side of the cost is, I live in it. I was born in it. It is worth everything that goes into it. You have my word on that, for whatever the word of someone from 340 years in your future is worth. Take care of yourself. Take care of your notes. Use what you know the way you have used it in the past 32 hours, carefully, and in service of something larger than the moment. The channel will close when we leave. There will be no further signal. What happens next is yours. She read it twice. She sent it. Then she went to the bridge. The bridge had the particular quality of atmosphere that Voss associated with the final minutes before a critical maneuver. Quiet in the specific way that spaces are quiet when everyone in them is paying very close attention, the ambient sounds of the ship systems suddenly audible in their individual components. The soft cycling of environmental systems and the low hum of power distribution and the barely perceptible vibration of the impulse manifolds that ran through the deck plates and up through the soles of your boots if you stood still long enough to notice it. Patel was at the science station. Vasquez had come to the bridge personally, running the fold reopening sequence from a portable engineering console she had set up beside the main engineering display, her team patched in from the lower decks through a comm channel that was carrying a continuous flow of diagnostic data in both directions. Torres was at tactical with his secondary displays running the surface sensor picture and the military communication traffic in parallel. Okafor was at ops, her hands moving across her console with the practiced efficiency of an officer who had run this particular sequence in her head 100 times in the past 6 hours and was ready. Tyrell was at the con, his course plotted and locked, the Meridian's position precisely calculated relative to the fold's quantum signature, the geometry of the maneuver mapped to tolerances that left no room for improvisation. Preconditioning confirmed complete, Vasquez said. Fold quantum signature is fully primed and stable within storm parameters. Reopening pulse calculations are locked. She looked up at Voss. Commander, we are ready. Sensor picture. Voss said, to Torres. Military tracking activity is at reduced capacity due to storm interference, Torres reported. 3 of the 6 orbital imaging platforms we've been monitoring are showing positioning errors consistent with geomagnetic disruption. Ground-based radar coverage has significant gaps across the northern hemisphere. We are as invisible as we are going to be. He paused. The directed energy facilities are still active but their ranging accuracy is compromised. Window is good, Commander. Osei's channel. Okafor checked. Still open. No incoming transmission. Voss nodded. She looked at the view screen, at Earth one final time, blue and white and achingly familiar, wrapped in the luminous violence of the storm, the aurora blazing across its upper atmosphere in colors that she had grown up knowing from photographs and history lessons and now had seen with her own eyes from close enough to count the cloud formations over the Pacific. She thought about what it was. Not just the planet. The idea of it. The specific, unrepeatable fact of 7 billion people in the process of becoming something. Imperfectly, painfully, at enormous cost, with no guarantee and no safety net and no one from the future watching over them except, for the past 32 hours, one crew on one ship that had been placed here by someone who understood that the distance between what humanity was and what it would become was not crossed by grand gestures or institutional machinery but by individuals making choices in the dark. She thought about Amara. She thought about what she was doing right now. Sitting at her workstation, or standing at the window watching the aurora, or writing in her notes, carrying the weight of what she knew with the discipline of someone who had been told it mattered and had chosen to believe it. Execute, Voss said. Vasquez's hands moved across her console. The Meridian's warp core, deep in the ship's engineering section, rose through its power curve with the controlled precision of a system that had been prepared for exactly this moment, the energy output climbing through the pre-calculated curve, the directed pulse forming in the navigational deflector assembly, the quantum frequency locked to the primed fold signature that Vasquez had spent 4 days coaxing into readiness. The pulse fired. It lasted 3 seconds. To any sensor platform on the surface that was still functioning with sufficient accuracy to register it, the energy signature would have appeared as a brief, localized intensification of the storm's electromagnetic activity, consistent with a natural phenomenon, consistent with the variability of a G4 geomagnetic event, indistinguishable from the background noise of the most electromagnetically turbulent night Earth had experienced in over a decade. The fold responded. On Patel's display, the quantum signature of the subspace tear flared from dormancy into full resonance, its engineered geometry responding to the pulse with the precision of a lock receiving exactly the right key. The tolerances that Vasquez had identified, the clean lines that had no business being there in a natural fold, now serving their purpose as the pathway opened and the fabric of spacetime parted along the seam that had been built into it by hands that neither Voss nor anyone on her crew would ever be able to identify. Fold is open, Patel said, her voice carrying the flat, focused intensity of a scientist reading instruments at the most important moment of her career. Quantum signature stable. Temporal coordinates locked to origin point. A pause. Commander, the fold is clean. The geometry it's perfect. Whatever built this knew what they were doing. Time to traverse? Voss asked. 11 minutes at full impulse to the fold's aperture, then the traverse itself takes approximately 40 seconds, Tyrell reported from the con. Course is locked. All stations, confirm ready, Voss said. The confirmations came back in sequence: engineering, tactical, ops, science, con. Each one the voice of a crew member who had spent 4 days managing an impossible situation with the professionalism of people trained to handle the unprecedented and had emerged on the other side intact, having done, as best Voss could assess, exactly what had been needed. Helm, she said. Take us home. The Meridian broke cloak as she moved toward the fold, her hull briefly visible to any surface observer with the right equipment and the right piece of sky. A dark shape against the aurora, massive and unmistakable and gone again in the time it took to register, accelerating toward a tear in spacetime that no one on the planet below had the instruments to see. On Okafor's display, the channel to the surface registered one final incoming transmission. It had arrived 11 seconds after the fold opened, and it was 7 words. Okafor read it. She looked at Voss. Commander. Message from Dr. Osei. Read it, Voss said. Okafor read it. The message said, thank you. Go well. I have work to do. The Meridian entered the fold at full impulse. The aperture closed behind them with the quiet, precise finality of something that had accomplished its purpose. The storm raged on above the planet, indifferent and beautiful, painting the atmosphere in colors that people across the northern hemisphere were stepping outside to look at, tipping their faces up toward a sky that had, for a few extraordinary days, contained something extraordinary, and that was now, to every sensor, every instrument, every military tracking platform that had spent 4 days searching it with patient, methodical persistence, empty again. On the ground in Mountain View, California, in a lab that smelled of old coffee and the specific kind of productive silence that accumulates in rooms where serious work has been done, Dr. Amara Osei closed the channel on her monitoring equipment. She sat for a moment in the quiet. She looked at the aurora through the north-facing window, still blazing, still pulsing with its slow, magnificent rhythm, unconcerned with the fact that the thing it had been covering was gone. She looked at her notes. For days of them now, dense and precise and documented with the methodical care of someone who understood that what she was holding was not hers alone, was never going to be hers alone, but was not yet ready to be anyone else's. She picked up the legal pad. She held it for a moment. She thought about what she had been told and what she had been asked to do with it and what the difference was between a secret and a seed and how long a seed could survive before it needed to be planted. She thought about 30 years of being right about something the world kept telling her was probably wrong. She thought about what it meant to know, not believe, not hope, not theorize. But know, with the certainty of direct transmission and 32 hours of conversation and a signal that 3 independent analyses had confirmed and a message that had told her yes, your world makes it, you have my word, to know that the work mattered. She opened her desk drawer. She took out a fresh legal pad. She uncapped her pen. She began to write. Not the log. Not the documentation. Something else. Something longer and more careful and addressed, in its structure and its intention, not to the present moment but to the people who would need it later, in the years and decades that were coming. When the groundwork would need to be laid and the questions would need to be framed and someone would need to have done the work of thinking clearly about what first contact actually meant and how to prepare for it and why it mattered that humanity met what was coming with its best judgment rather than its worst fear. She wrote through the night. The aurora faded toward dawn. The storm passed. She kept writing. The Meridian came out of the fold at 0347 ship's time, tumbling. Not catastrophically, not the kind of tumbling that triggered emergency alarms and threw crew members out of their seats and filled the damage control channels with the overlapping voices of people reporting failures faster than anyone could track them. It was a controlled tumble, a 12-degree axial rotation that the ship's stabilizers corrected in 41 seconds, and the only evidence of it on the bridge was the brief, lurching sensation of artificial gravity compensating for an angular momentum that the inertial dampeners had not entirely anticipated, and the single console alarm from Tyrrell's con station that silenced itself almost immediately as the autopilot brought the ship back to standard orientation. But the sensors came back online clean, and the stars outside the view screen were in the right positions, and the chronometer that Patel had been watching with the intensity of someone whose entire professional credibility was riding on a single number resolved itself in the first 15 seconds after emergence and showed a date and time that were, within acceptable variance, exactly where they were supposed to be. 24th century. Their century. Their timeline. Patel let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for the entire 40-second traverse, which Voss found both understandable and faintly alarming, and then straightened at her station with the composure of someone who was going to process the emotional dimension of the past 4 days at a later time and in a private location and was absolutely not going to do it on the bridge in front of the crew. Temporal position confirmed, she said, her voice entirely level. We are home. The bridge absorbed this in the particular way that groups of people absorb the end of a sustained crisis. Not with celebration, because the relief was too deep and too complicated for celebration, and not with silence, because the relief needed somewhere to go, but with a collective exhalation that manifested as a slight relaxation in posture across every station, a fractional decrease in the tension that had been held in every set of shoulders on the bridge for 4 days. And one moment where Ensign Tyrrell at the con put his hands flat on his console and looked at them for a few seconds as if checking that they were still there. Status report, Voss said. The reports came back in the familiar sequence of a crew conducting a post-incident assessment, warp core stable, shields at standard, weapons online, life support nominal, structural integrity at 97% with minor stress fractures in the secondary hull consistent with the fold traverse, nothing that required immediate attention. The communications array was fully operational. Navigation was nominal. Medical was reporting 3 minor injuries from the initial tumble, none serious. The Meridian was intact. Her crew was intact. They were home. Voss sat in the command chair and let the reports wash over her and thought, with the part of her mind that was not occupied with the practical business of post-incident command, about what they were bringing back with them. Not in terms of damage or contamination, Patel's final temporal variance readings had confirmed a clean traverse, the fold closing behind them without residual quantum signature, the timeline presenting as stable within the parameters that the Federation's temporal science community used to designate a successful return. By every measurable standard, they had done what the Temporal Prime Directive required. They had been in a sensitive historical period and they had come home without leaving a footprint large enough to alter the primary trajectory. By the measurable standards. What was not measurable? What would not appear in any of the reports that Voss was going to have to write in the next 72 hours, the extensive, carefully documented incident reports that a temporal displacement event of this magnitude required, the ones that would go to Starfleet Command and the Department of Temporal Investigations and the Federation Science Council and every other institutional body that had jurisdiction over what had just happened. Was the thing that she was carrying back personally, in the part of her mind that incident reports did not have access to. She was carrying the knowledge that it had not been an accident. She was carrying the knowledge of the fold and its engineered tolerances and the anonymous communication to a scientist in California 14 months before the event and the precise timing of the storm and the probability models ? And everything that those things added up to when you put them together and looked at the whole. She was carrying the knowledge that someone from a point in time beyond her own had needed the Meridian in orbit above 21st century Earth for 4 days, had arranged for it, had trusted the specific crew of this specific ship to make the specific decisions that the design required, and had been, as best she could assess, correct in that trust. She was carrying the question of who. It was not a question she was going to answer today, or this week, or possibly this year. The evidence she had was real and internally consistent, but it was not the kind of evidence that resolved into a clean identification. It pointed toward a level of temporal sophistication that existed somewhere beyond her own era, possibly far beyond it, and the Federation's understanding of what lay in that direction was, by definition, incomplete. She could file a report. She would file a report. She would include the full geometry analysis and Vasquez's findings and Patel's probability modeling and the full record of everything that had suggested design rather than accident, and the Department of Temporal Investigations would do with it whatever the Department of Temporal Investigations did with reports that opened questions they could not yet answer, which in her experience was to classify them carefully and add them to a category of files that accumulated with patient institutional humility until the knowledge base caught up with the mystery. What she was not going to include in the report was Amara. She had thought about this during the 40 seconds of the fold traverse, which was the strangest place she had ever done her clearest thinking, the quantum geometry of the pathway doing something to her sense of time and consequence that made decisions feel less contingent and more like recognitions. Like arriving at something that had been true all along and was only now becoming visible. She had thought about what the report required and what it did not require and where the line was between institutional transparency and individual protection, and she had arrived at a conclusion that she was comfortable with and that she believed, on reflection, was consistent with the spirit of what the Temporal Prime Directive was actually trying to protect. The Temporal Prime Directive was designed to protect timelines. The Temporal Prime Directive was designed to protect timelines. It was designed to prevent interference with the natural development of civilizations. Everything that had happened in the past 4 days had been, at its core, an attempt to honor that principle in a situation for which the principle had not been written, and honoring it had required, at the most critical junctures, the judgment of individuals rather than the application of rules. It had required Voss's decision to respond to the scan. It had required Amara's decision to maintain the channel. It had required the unnamed entity that had built the fold to trust that both of those decisions would be made correctly. The report would contain what it needed to contain. It would document the displacement event, the temporal variance readings, the full geometry findings, the successful return. It would note the 12 seconds of surface exposure before the cloak engaged and assess it as a contained Type 2 contamination event consistent with the historical record of the period. It would include Patel's analysis of the fold as a potentially engineered structure and flag it for further investigation by DTI. It would be thorough and accurate and complete in every dimension that the institutional framework required it to be complete in. It would not contain the name Amara Osei. It would not contain the frequency, the content, or the existence of the communications channel. It would not contain the 7-word final transmission. It would not contain the legal pad, or the 30 years, or the thing that Voss had told her in the penultimate message that fell outside the bounds of what she was permitted to share. That was a decision she was making consciously and with full understanding of its implications. It was the same decision that the entity who had built the fold had made, the decision that some things were better protected by individual judgment than by institutional process, that the historical record had gaps in it for reasons that were sometimes good ones, that the word contained meant something worth preserving. She would live with it. It was the kind of thing you lived with, and the living with it was part of what it meant to have been trusted with it. "Commander," Patel said, from the science station. Her voice had the quality of someone who has been doing quiet calculations and has arrived at something she wants to say carefully. "I've completed the post-reverse temporal variance analysis. Full spectrum, all parameters." She paused. "The timeline reads clean. No measurable deviation from baseline in any accessible historical period. The Type 2 contamination event is stable. Consistent with historical record as preserved, no evidence of cascade effects." Another pause, this one carrying a different weight. "And there is one other finding." Voss turned. "Tell me." "In the 21st century historical record, the period we were just in, there is new data." Patel looked at her display, then at Voss. "Not new to history. New to our access. Data that appears to have been added to the Federation Historical Archive. Not recently, but in a manner that was not accessible to my pre-mission database queries." She pulled it up on the main view screen. "It is a partial declassification of a previously restricted document. Filed in the archive under a program designation that was previously listed as classified with all details redacted." Voss looked at the view screen. She read the designation. She read it twice. "Watchful. What does it say?" she asked, though she had the feeling, the recursive, vertiginous feeling of someone who keeps finding the same architecture from different angles, that she already knew. "It is a personnel record," Patel said. "Partial. Several sections remain restricted. But the accessible portions describe an individual who is credited, in the historical record of pre-contact Earth, with a body of work in scientific research and institutional development spanning approximately 4 decades in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The record does not detail specific contributions in full, but it characterizes them as foundational to the development of humanity's pre-contact scientific and philosophical readiness." She looked at Voss. "The individual is described in the record as the architect of frameworks that proved essential to humanity's successful navigation of the first contact period. The notation indicates that her work was conducted largely outside of public view, that its influence was institutional rather than personal, and that its significance was not fully understood until the historical record was reviewed from the perspective of the Federation's founding era." She paused. "Her name is listed in the accessible portion of the record," Patel said. "Commander, I think you should see it." Voss crossed the bridge to the science station. She looked at the display. She looked at the name in the accessible portion of the watchful record, partially declassified, visible now in a Federation historical archive that had not contained it before the Meridian had returned through the fold, as if the act of returning had closed a loop that had been open and left an accounting in the record of what the loop had contained. The name was there. Voss looked at it for a long time. She thought about 30 years of preparation. She thought about a legal pad and cold coffee and a north-facing window and an aurora blazing over a city that did not know what was in its sky. She thought about 7 words: thank you. Go well. I have work to do. She thought about the work. For decades of it, conducted outside of public view, institutional rather than personal, foundational to a first contact that would not happen for another 48 years after the night the fold closed and the signal went quiet and a scientist in California sat alone with what she knew and began to write. She thought about what it meant that the record existed. That someone, at some point after the founding of the Federation, had decided that this much at least could be preserved. Not the frequency. Not the channel. Not the specific content of the transmissions. But the name, and the characterization, and the acknowledgement that the work had mattered and that the person who had done it had understood its purpose even when no one around her could. She thought about the entity that had built the fold. She thought about what they had known and when they had known it and how far forward you had to stand in time to see, with the kind of clarity that warranted that level of intervention, that one scientist in one lab on one night was the thread the whole thing turned on. She thought about the word pulled. She straightened. She turned back to the command chair. She looked at her crew. Patel and Torres and Okafor and Tyrell, all of them watching her with the quiet attention of people who had been through 4 days of the most significant experience of their careers and were waiting, in the professional and human way that crews wait after something large and irreversible, for their commander to say something that gave the experience a shape they could carry. She thought about what to say. She thought about all of it. The fold and the storm and the channel and the name in the record and the question of who had built the door and why and what it meant that the answer was not yet available to anyone in this century. She thought about what it meant to live in a future that someone had worked 40 years in the dark to build. Log entry, she said, and Okafor's hands moved to the recording function. USS Meridian, Commander Elara Voss commanding. Stardate, she gave the stardate. We have returned from a temporal displacement event covering a period of 4 days in the 21st century, Earth calendar year 2025. Temporal variance readings are clean. Timeline integrity is confirmed stable. The crew performed with distinction under conditions for which no standard operating procedure fully prepares you. She paused, choosing the next words with the care she had applied to everything in the past 4 days. In the course of this mission, I was reminded that the Federation is not an institution. It is not a treaty or a charter or a fleet of starships or a body of regulations, however wise those regulations may be. It is a choice. Made by individuals, repeatedly, across generations, often without recognition and sometimes without witnesses, to build something larger than themselves and trust that the work will matter even when the evidence for that trust is incomplete. She paused again. I met someone this week who made that choice for 40 years before she had any evidence at all. I want the record to note that she was right. And that it mattered. And that the future she helped build is worth every hour of it. She looked at the view screen, at the stars in their right positions, at the particular configuration of light and distance that meant home. End log entry. The bridge was quiet for a moment. Then Torres said, from tactical, without looking up from his console, Commander. We're receiving a hail from Starfleet Command. They want to know where we've been. Voss sat down in the command chair. She straightened her uniform. She thought about the report she was going to write, and what it would contain, and what it would protect, and the weight of the distinction between those two things and why the weight was worth carrying. Put them through, she said. The Department of Temporal Investigations reviewed the Meridian's incident report for 11 weeks before closing the file. Their findings were thorough and, in the specific way that institutional findings tend to be, incomplete. They confirmed the temporal displacement event. They confirmed the clean return. They confirmed Patel's analysis of the fold geometry as consistent with potential artificial construction and flagged it for ongoing investigation under a classification level that ensured it would be reviewed by people with the authority to understand its implications and the discretion to handle them appropriately. They issued Commander Voss a formal commendation for her handling of the containment protocols and a separate, quieter notation in her service record acknowledging the judgment she had exercised at the critical decision points of the mission. They did not find the channel. They did not find the transmissions. They did not find the name on the legal pad or the 7 words at the end or the aurora through the north-facing window. Those things lived in Voss's private ledger, alongside the question of who had built the fold, and they would live there for the rest of her career, carried with the particular discipline of someone who understood that some knowledge was better protected by individual judgment than institutional process, and who had made her peace with the weight of that. The watchful record remained in the Federation Historical Archive, partially declassified, the name visible and the details sparse, the characterization preserved in the careful language of historians who knew the work had mattered and could not fully explain why without the context that had been, deliberately and wisely, kept out of the record. In the 21st century, 340 years earlier and simultaneous in the way that time is always both, a scientist sat at a desk in the early hours of a California morning and wrote. The aurora faded. The storm passed. The work continued. It would continue for 40 years. Quietly, institutionally, outside of public view, in the patient accumulation of frameworks and preparations and carefully seeded ideas that would prove, when the moment finally came, to be exactly what humanity needed to meet it well. The fold was gone. The signal was dark. The stars held their positions above a planet that did not know what it had been given. It did not need to know. It only needed the work. Live long and prosper. More stories await.